It's easy enough to see that intellectual humility is important and that the world needs a lot more of it. But it may not be entirely clear what intellectual humility might be. In this lecture, Dr. Peter Samuelson and myself, Dr. Ian Church, will be asking the big question, what is intellectual humility? And offering what are hopefully some helpful answers. Dr. Samuelson was the Director of Research and Evaluation for the Thrive Foundation for Youth. He earned his PhD in educational psychology from Georgia State University in Atlanta, specializing in the moral development of children. And I am a research fellow here at the Aiden Center at the University of Edinburgh. I earned my PhD in philosophy in the St. Andrews Sterling Joint Program in Philosophy, and I specialize in virtue epistemology. Dr. Samuelson and myself have authored a new book, Intellectual Humility, An Introduction to the Philosophy and Science. Intellectual humility is extremely important. All too often, when faced with difficult questions, people are prone to dismiss and marginalize dissent. And around the world, politics is incredibly polarizing, and in some parts of the world, even extremely dangerous. And whether it's Christian fundamentalism, Islamic extremism, or militant atheism, religious dialogue remains tinted by a truly terrifying and dehumanizing arrogance, dogma, and ignorance. So on the face of it, the world needs more people who are appropriately sensitive to their intellectual frailty. The world needs more people who are more likely to consider the possibility that their political, religious, or moral beliefs just might be mistaken. The world needs more people who are appropriately sensitive to the reasons both for and against their beliefs. The world needs more intellectual humility. But what is intellectual humility? That's the question we're going to be considering in this lecture. In the first half, I will explore a rough philosophical account of intellectual humility. And in the second half, Dr. Peter Samuelson will explore how psychology and cognitive science may help us further answer that important question. Now, at first blush, we might think that humility is the virtuous mean between something like arrogance on the one hand and self-deprecation or servility on the other. The humble person, to put it roughly, doesn't value herself too much, which would be arrogance, nor does she value herself too little, which would be diffidence, servility, or self-deprecation. Instead, she thinks of herself, her value, her status amongst her peers, her abilities as she ought. Building off of this extremely simple and basic view of humility, I think an intuitive account of intellectual humility might seem to follow. We might imagine that intellectual humility is the virtuous mean between something like intellectual arrogance and intellectual servility. The intellectually humble person, then, doesn't overly value her beliefs, which would be intellectual arrogance, nor does she undervalue them, which would be intellectual servility. Instead, she values her beliefs, their epistemic status, her intellectual abilities as she ought. Given its focus on beliefs, this rough approximation of intellectual humility is what I'll be calling the doxastic, that is, relating to beliefs account of intellectual humility. What I want to do in the first half of this talk is try to develop this account of intellectual humility a bit further. Think about the process of throwing a pot on a potter's wheel. So far, we only have a rough piece of clay before us. But in this talk, I want to try to see if we can shape that clay a bit further and see where we end up. But before we get started, however, I want to briefly consider a few other accounts of intellectual humility, a few other definitions that philosophers have put forward and highlight a few worries we might have against them. All of this, I hope, will help motivate us to consider an alternative account of intellectual humility in the third video. In this video, we'll consider the two dominant accounts of intellectual humility in the contemporary philosophical literature. That is, if you were to search through the philosophy journals and the relevant philosophical books, these are the definitions of intellectual humility that you'd more than likely come across. But as we consider these dominant accounts of intellectual humility, I also want to highlight a few worries we might have against them. Now, the goal here is not to show that these accounts are necessarily wrong. It might very well be possible to intelligently and cogently disarm the worries that I'm going to raise. Nevertheless, I hope that highlighting some of the worries facing contemporary accounts of intellectual humility might first give us a snapshot of the ongoing debate about what intellectual humility could be, and secondly, that it might also incline us to consider an alternative account, specifically what I've been calling the doxastic account of intellectual humility. The two accounts of intellectual humility that I want to consider in this video are, first, the low concern for status account, which has been advocated by philosophers like Bob Roberts and Jay Wood, And secondly, the limitations owning account, which has been advocated by philosophers like Dennis Whitcomb, Heather Baddeley, Daniel Howard Snyder, and Jason Baer. Now let's start with the former, the low concern for status account of intellectual humility. In their 2003 article, Humility and Epistemic Goods, and their 2007 book, Intellectual Virtues, an Essay in Regulative Epistemology, Bob Roberts and Jay Wood give us what is now the seminal account of intellectual humility in the literature. According to their account, the low concern for status account, intellectual humility is viewed as merely the opposite of intellectual arrogance or improper pride. According to Roberts and Wood, these vices are centered on the promotion of the social well-being of the possessor. And as such, intellectual humility is a striking or unusual unconcern for social importance, and thus a kind of emotional insensitivity to the issues of status. The thought here is that the intellectually humble person isn't concerned about the status that might be accrued by pursuing intellectual endeavors. Instead, they pursue intellectual goods for their own sake. Now, there are quite a few things to like about this view, I think. It seems to rightly capture a social dynamic to the virtue, but I think it also has some serious problems. The first question we might have is, can't someone be too humble? I think we generally tend to think of intellectual humility as a virtue between vices like intellectual arrogance on the one hand and intellectual servility on the other. Someone, it seems, can be too humble. They can be so self-deprecating and so self-lessening that they're vicious, not virtuous. However, since the low concern for status account sees intellectual humility as merely the opposite of intellectual arrogance, then it's not clear how it can capture this idea that someone can be too humble. Consider the following example. This is called botanist. Susan is a highly acclaimed botanist with a litany of scientific achievements and an almost unmatched knowledge of orchids. However, Susan cares nothing for social status or the accolades of her peers. Frank, on the other hand, is a novice botanist at best, but is wildly obsessed with his status amongst his peers and how much they think of him. To make matters worse, Frank is unfortunately an idiot. Susan and Frank know each other and each other's accomplishments very well, and being obsessed with status and intimidated by Susan's accomplishments, Frank is regularly antagonistic towards Susan. Susan and Frank are at a botanical garden when they have a disagreement about the scientific name of a certain species of orchid. Caring nothing for her intellectual status and accolades or Frank's negative status, Susan takes Frank's dissent seriously and treats him as an intellectual peer. Now, if Susan is caring so little for status that she fails to recognize her expertise over and against Frank's ignorance and takes his dissent seriously, treating him like a peer, then perhaps Susan is being too humble here. Perhaps we think that it's actually vicious, not virtuous, for Susan to take Frank to be a peer when it comes to botany. But since intellectual humility is seen as merely the opposite of intellectual arrogance, it's not at all clear how the low concern for status account of intellectual humility could possibly account for this idea, that someone can be too intellectually humble. Now, there's another worry facing the low concern for status account that arises when we consider scenarios where there's no social status to be had or cared about. While intellectual humility plausibly has an important social dimension, the Roberts and Wood view, the low concern for status view, seems to make a social context absolutely essential. So consider another scenario, and this is called stranded. Let's say that tragedy has befallen Frank, our character from the previous case, the ignorant yet wannabe botanist, and he has been shipwrecked on a small, deserted island. He is truly and entirely alone, and with no social status to care about, Frank can no longer be obsessed with his status amongst his peers and how much they think of him. According to the low concern for status account of intellectual humility, Frank, given that he is trapped on his deserted island with no social status to care about, cannot help but be intellectually humble. If there is no status to be cared about, Frank cannot help but have a low concern for his social status. And what is more, it is conceptually impossible for Frank to be intellectually arrogant, according to this view. Because again, being intellectually arrogant requires a concern for social status, and there's no social status to be concerned about on Frank's deserted island. Aside from creating a strange asymmetry regarding when someone can be humble or arrogant, such a scenario might also make the low concern for status view seem a little bit counterintuitive. It seems like Frank, the dunce, as he sits alone on his deserted island, telling himself that all his botanical judgments are right and true and good, that he could be rightly described as being intellectually arrogant. But, worryingly, that's not a possibility that the low concern for status view seems to allow. Okay, so now we've tried to show what the low concern for status view is and a couple worries we might have against it. So let's consider the limitations owning account now and see how it fares. According to this view, intellectual humility is a proper attentiveness to and owning of one's intellectual limitations. As Dennis Whitcomb and others have summarized, when life calls for one to be mindful of a limitation, then and only then will it appear on the ideally humble person's radar. And what goes for humility in general goes for intellectual humility in particular. And thankfully, this means that intellectual humility isn't just the opposite of intellectual arrogance. It's a virtuous mean on this account. If you are completely oblivious to your limitations, then on this view, you're going to be intellectually arrogant. Whereas in contrast, if you're someone who is overly attentive to and owning of your intellectual limitations, then you're going to be intellectually servile on this view. You'll be too humble, so to speak. And so it doesn't fall victim to the same sort of worries that we saw with Susan the botanist in the low concern for status account. That said, however, the limitations owning account of intellectual humility faces its own unique set of worries. Vices like intellectual arrogance and intellectual servility are sensitive to both intellectual strengths and intellectual limitations. So if you fail to recognize your limitations, or you overown or overattend your strengths, then you're going to be intellectually arrogant. And if you fail to recognize your strengths, or overown or overattend to your limitations, then you're going to be intellectually servile. But, importantly, according to the limitations owning account, intellectual humility is only sensitive to the attending to and ownership of intellectual limitations. Intellectual humility on this view is blind to intellectual strengths. And all this leads to some results that I'm not sure that we should own in a viable account of intellectual humility. Let's consider two of these worries. The first is that the limitations owning account of intellectual humility allows people to be intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant about the same thing at the exact same time. To see this, just imagine someone who's duly attentive to and owning of her intellectual limitations, so she's intellectually humble, but radically overestimates and brags about her corresponding intellectual strengths. And insofar as someone is intellectually arrogant, if they radically overestimate and brag about their strengths, then it looks like the limitations owning account leads to this very odd conclusion. It's possible for someone to be at once intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant about the same thing at the exact same time. And that might seem like a reason to reject the view. The inability to rule out someone being at once intellectually arrogant and intellectually humble is a limitation that I'm not sure we want to own in our accounts of intellectual humility. Of course, a defender of the limitations owning view might argue, and indeed some do indeed argue, that such a result is just metaphysically impossible for an agent who is, quote, fully internally rational. In other words, someone might argue that if I'm appropriately attending to my intellectual limitations, then if I'm fully internally rational, I simply can't overestimate my intellectual strengths. Conversely, if I overestimate my intellectual strengths, then if I'm going to be fully internally rational, then I simply can't be intellectually humble. I can't appropriately attend to and own my intellectual limitations. This response might seem initially unsatisfactory because, sadly, most everyone is less than fully internally rational. So such a response doesn't do anything to disarm the result that most everyone can be at once both intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant. But what is more, even if we grant that it would be metaphysically impossible for a fully internally rational agent to be both intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant, we might still worry, pre-theoretically, that intellectual humility should just be incompatible with being simultaneously intellectually arrogant. Just imagine someone said this to you. You need to meet Christopher. He's such a kind and humble guy, but you've got to watch out, though. He's an arrogant jerk. You'd think that whoever's just said this contradicted themselves. You wouldn't think, well, I guess Christopher must be less than fully internally rational. You think that whoever said such a thing is either using humble and arrogant in an extremely unusual or unorthodox way, or they simply don't understand the words that they're using. It seems like there is something wrong, or maybe counterintuitive, with a definition of intellectual humility that does not preclude someone, even a less than fully internally rational someone, being at once intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant. And if the limitations owning view gives us such definition, then that seems like a serious strike against it. But there is a different, but related worry that's lurking in this conceptual neighborhood. The limitations owning account of intellectual humility not only allows for someone being at once intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant, it also allows for someone to be at once intellectually humble and intellectually servile. Remember, intellectual servility is sensitive to both intellectual limitations and intellectual strengths on this view, where someone can be intellectually servile if they either over-own and over-attend to their limitations, or if they fail to attend to their strengths. And it's important to remember that intellectual humility here is completely blind to intellectual strengths. As such, someone could appropriately attend to and own their intellectual limitations and be intellectually humble, while completely failing to attend to their corresponding intellectual strengths, which would make them intellectually servile on this view. And it's worth noting that appealing to a fully internally rational agent doesn't seem to do any good here. It doesn't seem to be any help whatsoever. Even if a fully internally rational person can't appropriately attend to and own their limitations while overestimating their strengths, it's not at all clear that a fully internally rational person can't appropriately attend to and own their limitations while simply failing to attend to their corresponding strengths. There's nothing irrational about not attending to the logical consequences of one's beliefs. So we've seen how the two leading theories of intellectual humility in the philosophical literature each face two worries. The low concern for status view faces 1, worries about the possibility of someone being too humble, and 2, worries about scenarios devoid of social status. And the limitations owning view faces worries about 1, allowing for cases where someone can be at once intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant, and 2, allowing for cases where someone can be at once intellectually humble and intellectually servile. To be sure, I don't intend for these to be knocked down arguments against these views. I'm not trying to say that we should need to give up on these views. There might very well be viable ways to disarm the worries that I'm presenting here. However, I raise these worries to help motivate us to search for other alternative accounts of intellectual humility. In the next video, I'm going to explore one such alternative, the doxastic account of intellectual humility. In the first video, I noted that intellectual humility is extremely important, which motivated us to consider what such a virtue, if it is indeed a virtue, could possibly be. In the second video, we considered two leading philosophical accounts of intellectual humility and highlighted some worries that face them. In this video, I want to give a brief sketch of an alternative philosophical account of intellectual humility, the doxastic account of intellectual humility. The account I want to explore is not terribly theory-rich, I'll admit that. And one could draw from mountains of literature on the nature of intellectual virtues, virtue epistemology, or the history and nature of humility in general. But that's not what I aim to do in this talk. Here, I just want to follow our intuitions, stake a claim, and ultimately, though we won't have time for it in this lecture, get ready to defend it against the criticisms that will surely come. Remember, we're going to start with a rough piece of clay, but then we'll try to shape that piece of clay a little bit over the course of this video and see where we end up. As I mentioned in the first video, we might easily imagine that intellectual humility is the virtuous mean between intellectual arrogance on the one hand, and intellectual servility on the other. The intellectually humble person then doesn't overly value her beliefs, which would be intellectual arrogance, nor does she undervalue them, which would be intellectual servility. Instead, she values her beliefs, their epistemic status, and her intellectual abilities as she ought. Now let's call this basic messy view DA for doxastic account. Now, according to DA, intellectual humility is the virtue of valuing one's own beliefs as he or she ought. Okay, so admittedly, that's a really rough piece of clay. But again, we're going to try to shape that a little bit and see if we can make it a little bit nicer. Now, the first thing we might want to know is, what does this valuing amount to in this account? We might easily wonder, for example, if this valuing amounts to how firmly someone is holding on to their given beliefs, how resilient that given belief is to revision or relinquishment. And to some extent, that would make a lot of sense, I think. After all, it seems right to think that an intellectually arrogant person would be someone who is completely unwilling to change her belief in the face of disagreement or evidence to the contrary. Likewise, it seems right to think that an intellectually servile person would be someone who holds his beliefs loosely and revises or changes them at the proverbial drop of a hat. Intellectual humility, then, would amount to holding to your beliefs as firmly as you ought. But I think we can imagine situations that might suggest that this isn't the best way to understand the valuing in DA, in this basic doxastic account. So consider the following scenario. This is called convict. Connor has been charged and convicted of a series of extremely heinous crimes, and there is manifold evidence suggesting that he is indeed guilty. There's surveillance footage of Connor committing the crimes. There is his personal journal that explains in detail his criminal plans, motivation, and intent. There are several eyewitnesses to Connor's crimes. He even confesses in full. All in all, Connor's trial is an easy, open and shut case. Nevertheless, Connor's mother, who loves him very dearly, simply cannot bring herself to believe that he is guilty. She's seen the surveillance footage. She's read the diary. She's availed of all the relevant evidence against her son. Indeed, she does not blame the judge, the jury, or the judicial system for convicting him. Nevertheless, her love for her son bars her from believing that he is guilty of these heinous crimes. In such a scenario, Connor's mother's belief is extremely firm. Her love for her son simply renders her psychologically unable to believe that he's guilty. Is she being intellectually arrogant then? I don't think so, because she is entirely sensitive to all of the relevant reasons or evidence or justification against her belief. And she's sensitive to the dearth of any reasons or evidence or justification in favor of her belief. So perhaps the valuing in DA should not be a function of belief firmness. Maybe instead it should be some function of being sensitive to the relevant reasons or evidence or justification for or against one's belief. Or to use a catch-all phrase, we might say that intellectual humility is some function of being sensitive to the positive epistemic status for or against one's beliefs. So maybe we can shape our rough piece of clay a bit further along these lines. So consider the following revision. We're going to call this DA prime. So here, intellectual humility is the virtue of attributing positive epistemic status to one's own beliefs as he or she ought. Now, admittedly, this is still a rough piece of clay, no doubt, but I think we are getting somewhere with it. According to DA prime, if you attribute far more evidence, justification, or positive epistemic status to your belief than it merits, then you're going to be intellectually arrogant about that belief. Conversely, if you attribute far less evidence, justification, or positive epistemic status to a belief than it merits, then you're going to be intellectually servile when it comes to that belief. Intellectual humility on this view is the virtue of attributing positive epistemic status to one's own beliefs as you ought. Now, so far, so good, but there are a number of pressing questions that we still have to consider. Let's take a look at two such questions. First of all, what is determining the ought in DA prime? In other words, can we say anything further on about the normative component here? And secondly, is attribution the right sort of word we want to use when it comes to intellectual humility? After all, attributing positive epistemic status to a given belief seems like a highly reflective activity, one that simply couldn't be done subconsciously, say. And insofar as that seems like an unnecessary restriction on intellectual humility, maybe we should consider a different term. First of all, it seems like the positive epistemic status or evidence or justification someone ought to attribute to their own belief is the positive epistemic status that such beliefs actually have. So at the very least, perhaps the doxastic account of intellectual humility should be most concerned with whether or not someone is accurately tracking, be it consciously or subconsciously, the positive epistemic status that their beliefs actually enjoy. And what is more, to address the second question, accurately tracking positive epistemic status, perhaps unlike attributing positive epistemic status, does not seem to require highly reflective activity. Accurately tracking positive epistemic status, perhaps unlike attributing positive epistemic status, seems like the sort of thing that can be done implicitly or even subconsciously. So this might allow us to shape our piece of clay just a little bit further. Now we can consider another modification to our account. Now we're looking at DA double prime. According to this, intellectual humility is the virtue of accurately tracking the positive epistemic status of one's own beliefs. Now, on this view, if you think that one of your beliefs enjoys a tremendous amount of evidence, justification, or positive epistemic status when it actually doesn't, then you're intellectually arrogant about that belief. And in contrast, if you think that one of your beliefs enjoys a paltry amount of evidence, justification, or positive epistemic status when it actually enjoys a tremendous amount, then you're going to be intellectually servile about that particular belief. Intellectual humility, again, is the virtue of accurately tracking the positive epistemic status of your own beliefs. And I think this all makes a fair amount of sense. but I think we still need to make some sort of caveat to DA double prime in order to account for situations where someone has been non-culpably deceived, that is, deceived in a way that they can't be blamed for. Consider another scenario. This scenario is called lie. Mary has known Martha for many, many years and has always found her to be extremely trustworthy. One day, Martha is feeling a bit cheeky and decides to tell Mary a lie, pretty serious lie. Feigning a panic, Martha runs up to Mary and tells her that Mary's house is on fire. Naturally enough, since Mary has never known Martha to be anything other than entirely honest, Mary, non-culpably, yet falsely believes that her house is on fire, and takes such a belief to have a lot of positive epistemic status via Martha's testimony, and as such, Mary heads home in a hurry. In order for DA double prime to rightly handle scenarios like this, we need Mary's strong belief, that is her belief which is taken to have a lot of positive epistemic status, to not count as intellectual arrogance simply because she was non-culpably deceived. However, someone might worry that the fact that Mary's belief is based on a lie means that it enjoys far less positive epistemic status than Mary actually imagines it to. To avoid such a worry, we'll have to make a final adjustment to our clay, to the doxastic account of intellectual humility. Here we'll call it DA triple prime. Intellectual humility is the virtue of accurately tracking what one could non-culpably take to be the positive epistemic status of one's own beliefs. And since Mary is non-culpable in believing Martha's testimony, DA triple prime helps guarantee that Mary won't be wrongfully ascribed with intellectual arrogance. According to this way of thinking, intellectual humility can be assessed along two axes: how much positive epistemic status a given belief enjoys, and how much positive epistemic status a given agent thinks that it enjoys. And if you're like me and casually think that the truth of a theory corresponds somehow to whether or not it can be graphed, you'll be happy to see the following image. Now, again, I'm suggesting that intellectual humility is the virtue of accurately tracking the positive epistemic status of your beliefs in proportion to the amount of positive epistemic status that your beliefs actually enjoy. So, for example, if I ascribe my idiosyncratic religious or anti-religious belief with far more positive epistemic status than it really enjoys, then I'm guilty of intellectual arrogance, and my belief will fall in the upper left-hand corner of the graph. Alternatively, if I ascribe my belief that microwaves are safe, for example, with far less positive epistemic status than it really enjoys, perhaps because I perused the back alleys of the internet and took the unsubstantiated anxieties of a blogger seriously, then I'm guilty of intellectual servility, and my belief will fall in the lower right-hand corner of the graph. While there's certainly more work that needs to be done, in other words, there's certainly more shaping that we could do to this lump of clay that we have before us, I think this account of intellectual humility, what I've been calling the doxastic account of intellectual humility, tracks our intuitions across a wide range of cases. And what is more, it does not seem to fall victim to the same sort of worries that afflict the low concern for status account or the limitations owning account of intellectual humility. Since the doxastic account represents intellectual humility as a virtuous mean between intellectual arrogance and intellectual servility, and does not require a social context, then it does not fall victim to the same worries as the low concern for status account. And since the doxastic account does not, as far as I can tell, afford scenarios where someone can be at once intellectually humble and intellectually arrogant, or intellectually humble and intellectually servile, then it does not seem to fall victim to the same sort of worries that have afflicted the low concern for status account of intellectual humility. Now, does this mean that the doxastic account is the final word when it comes to intellectual humility? As much as I'd like to think so, I know this isn't the case. There are plenty of worries we might have against the doxastic account, and we just haven't had time to bring those up here, not in the time we have. Nevertheless, I tried to give us some reasons to think, even if they are ultimately inconclusive reasons, that the doxastic account of intellectual humility is a good way to think about this virtue from a philosophical perspective. In the next video, Dr. Peter Samuelson will briefly explore how empirical research, namely from psychology and cognitive science, might help us further elucidate and understand this very important virtue.
As Dr. Church indicated, my task in this brief lecture is to explore how empirical research might help us further elucidate intellectual humility. Specifically, how both existing and new approaches in the psychological sciences might contribute to understanding this important virtue. I would like to begin by painting a portrait of an intellectually humble person using the wisdom of the folk. My colleagues and I, including Dr. Church, initiated a study to find out what regular people might think when they conceive of an intellectually humble person, what kind of traits that person might have, etc. While most people, save some philosophers and psychologists, have probably not given intellectual humility much thought, it turns out they have a fairly sophisticated understanding of what an intellectually humble person is like. They may not be able to quickly define it, but they know it when they see it. It's a little like the reaction U.S. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart had in the 80s when he admitted he had trouble defining hardcore pornography in a case, and he said, "I know it when I see it." Intellectual humility is a little like that. Not like pornography, but like other complex and hard-to-define concepts. We know them when we see them. Psychologists call such notions implicit theories. They have studied such complex concepts as intelligence, creativity, and wisdom, to name a few. In our study, we began by asking people to think of words and phrases that characterize an intellectually humble person. From this, we got a list of about 101 words. Then we asked a separate group of people to rate these words from 1 to 7 as to how well they describe an intellectually humble person. And here are our top 10. Humble, not a show-off, doesn't brag, modest, intelligent, smart, thinker, humility, love of learning, and intellectual. Now, in the last step in this process, we took the top 50 rated words and phrases and asked a group of people to sort the descriptions into categories according to how similar they were to each other. Through a statistical procedure, we added up the number of times the words were paired with each other, giving us a sense of how many distinct clusters of words there were. Next, we plotted the position of these words in three-dimensional space, so that two words often associated with each other would end up located close to each other on the graph. Through these procedures, we created a semantic map of the relationship of these words to each other according to how similar they were perceived to be. And you can see this in the figure that you see on the screen. And you see we discovered three distinct clusters of descriptors, three dimensions of intellectually humble person. There's an epistemic dimension that's circled in red that includes descriptors like smart, bright, and intelligent, combined with elements such as curiosity, inquisitiveness, and love of learning. A self-oriented interpersonal dimension, circled in green with words like modest, not a show-off, and doesn't brag, which indicate how a person is perceived by others. And then there's an other-oriented interpersonal dimension, circled in blue, with descriptors like polite, honest, reliable, and unselfish, which indicate how a person interacts with others. So there's this cognitive side of intellectual humility, which has to do with how one thinks, how one exercises one's intellect, and then there's this social side that has to do with how one thinks of oneself in relationship to others, that is intrapersonal, and how one interacts with others, that is interpersonal. I would like to keep these dimensions in mind as we examine various aspects of the psychology that helps us understand intellectual humility. Our goal with this brief introduction and with the whole course is to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what an intellectually humble person looks like, how that person thinks, how that person acts, how that person interacts with others. So 5 questions about intellectual humility lead us to 5 different areas of psychological sciences to answer those questions. The first question is, how do we become intellectually humble? And so we look to developmental psychology for insights about how this virtue develops in human beings and how it might change over time. The second question, what can human cognition tell us about intellectual humility? And here cognitive psychology can help us think about aspects of human cognition that both promote and inhibit the exercise of intellectual humility. The third question, are some people born humble? Personality and social psychology help us understand the traits of an intellectually humble person and how enduring those traits are. The fourth question, how do emotions affect our ability to be intellectually humble? Research on the impact of emotion on our thinking and our interacting with others in the exchange of ideas can inform the study of intellectual humility. Finally, how do we know who is intellectually humble? Given this rich and complex portrait of an intellectually humble person that psychology offers us, how can we test people and measure their level of intellectual humility to know how we might grow this important virtue? So how do we become intellectually humble? There's an age-old debate within psychology called the nature-nurture debate. The essence of this debate is this: are our personalities and traits, including intellectual humility, more a matter of our genetic makeup, which we inherit from our parents, that is nature, or are they more influenced by our surroundings, how we're raised, how we're rewarded or punished, that is, how we are nurtured? The answer is yes. That is, like all human traits, both nature and nurture influence the development of intellectual humility. So one area of investigation worth pursuing is to first determine what kinds of traits an intellectually humble person might have, and then to examine how much the expression of these traits is due to genetic influence. We don't have a lot to say about this right now, since the science of intellectual humility is new, but we can look into how personality psychology has examined the role of genetic inheritance of such enduring traits as open-mindedness and agreeableness and conscientiousness, which are aspects of what are known as the Big Five personality traits, traits you might expect in an intellectually humble person. Then we can see that these genes determine about 35 to 60% of the expression of these traits in people. We might expect that genes influence the expression of intellectual humility in similar ways. Next, we can turn to developmental psychology for an answer to the question, how do we become intellectually humble? Part of how we answer this question will have to do with how we view human nature and the developing child. Are children little scientists, like the famous developmental psychologist Jean Piaget maintained, acquiring knowledge through their interaction with the world, experimenting with the world by forming theories about how the world works and testing those theories? Or, since much of our knowledge comes from the people who surround us, are children like little anthropologists who look around the social landscape to see who is trustworthy and a good source of information? How we answer these questions will guide our investigation into the development of intellectual humility. Those who think children are little scientists have proposed a theory of knowledge acquisition that is both widely accepted and particularly well suited to examine the growth and inhibition of intellectual humility in children, a theory developed by Gopnik and Wellman called theory theory. Theory theory posits that children think like little scientists by continually constructing and then revising theories about the structure of the world and the way the world works, including the social world. Children, like scientists, observe the world and begin to form theories about the makeup of the world, what might cause what, how this or that might work. Then, through experience, they gather more data that either reinforces the theory or revises it. Here's an example from anyone who has interacted with an infant in a high chair. The infant will drop something off the high chair and observe that it falls to the ground. The adult nearby will pick it up and return it to the child, and the child will promptly again drop the object. And this repeats ad nauseum. Now, the child may be testing a theory of gravity, that is, do things drop from a high position, fall to the ground if there's nothing to obstruct the fall? However, the child is also observing that the adult nearby will pick up the object and return it to the child. Perhaps the child is testing a theory that the adults always return an object that has fallen to the ground whenever the child drops it. As the child continues to test these theories by dropping objects over and over and over again, the child begins to see that the theory of gravity is pretty well established. Things, when dropped from high places, do always seem to fall to the ground. But about the theory that the adult nearby will always return the object, the evidence is more mixed. It seems the adult can tire of the experiment and sometimes pick it up and sometimes not. So using Dr. Church's doxaxic account of intellectual humility, we might say that the child holds the theory of gravity with some firmness and certainty, while the theory of the adults picking objects up she might hold with less firmness, since the evidence of that is more spotty. This idea that learning is a process of discovering just how firmly one ought to hold theories about the world has been further refined by Gopnik and Wellman through incorporating ideas from Bayesian statistics into their view of how children learn. Learning in this view is not just the process of holding a single theory about the world and then proving or disproving it before forming another theory that can be tested. It's rather a process of holding many hypotheses that might explain the evidence or the observed phenomena, and learning through experience and testing which is more probable. Bayesian learning is the process of assigning weights to any given hypothesis about the world according to how probable that hypothesis is compared to other alternative hypotheses. In the course of theory change, children gradually change the probability of multiple hypotheses rather than simply rejecting or accepting a single hypothesis. This way of thinking about knowledge acquisition fits well with the doxastic account of Dr. Church's just outlined. Returning to our example, the child in the high chair assigns a high probability to the theory of gravity, and we might say the child values this hypothesis highly, whereas the child might assign hypothesis that the adult will always pick up the object with less weight, and even begin to form alternative hypotheses to explain why the adult is inconsistent. Maybe the adult gets tired, or maybe the adult is stupid, and hold both of these hypotheses at once and begin to value one over the other as experience dictates. Indeed, there have been some experiments done along these lines to investigate the development of intellectual humility in children, especially regarding theory revision. That is, how long and how firmly do children hold initial theories in the face of new evidence? At a certain point, the weight assigned to the hypothesis is high enough, the theory of the world is valued highly enough so that alternative hypotheses are not entertained. So as the child grows, the child is certain about more and more things, but some things remain open to revision. Finding these points of development will be an important part of future research. This kind of investigation is decidedly within the epistemic side of intellectual humility. On the social side, investigations into how children trust informants is relevant to the study of the development of intellectual humility in children. My colleagues and I investigated how willing children were to trust certain kinds of informants about the name of an object, an unidentified object like this. We showed them cartoon pictures of these informants engaged in different kinds of actions that were determined to be either moral or immoral according to moral intuition theory. For example, we showed a picture of a dark-haired boy pushing down another child in order to get ahead in line, and pictured a light-haired boy helping another child. When we told them the dark-haired boy called the unidentified object a quoozy, while the light-haired boy called it a quinsy, and asked them which name they thought was the true name, it revealed which informant they trusted. The results show that the moral character of the informant did influence the information or the informant that the children trusted. Another experiment regarding intellectual humility of informants has also been conducted that revealed children do assess the character of informants as they decide whom to trust for knowledge about the world. Another thing we've learned from the developmental psychology is that children have this paradoxical mixture of intellectual arrogance and intellectual humility. They demonstrate intellectual arrogance in the fact that they grossly overestimate their knowledge and what they know. If you ask a child if they know how a toilet works, for example, they'll say confidently, yes. But when you ask them how it works, they're dumbfounded. Yet, in spite of thinking that they know everything, an aspect of intellectual arrogance, they are eager to learn, an endearing trait of the intellectually humble. Children are more aware of their mistakes, tend to be more intellectually humble, being more willing to ask for help and advice. Studies also show that children who have an incrementalist mindset of intelligence, that is, they believe that intelligence can be developed through study and hard work, are also more intellectually humble. We can confidently claim that children are not just little scientists, but little anthropologists as well. They hold theories of the world and test those theories by their experience, assigning value to certain ideas over others. They are sensitive to the social elements of knowledge acquisition, especially to the trustworthiness of informants. Studies into these elements of how children learn supports our understanding of intellectual humility, as having both epistemic and social dimensions. Developmental psychology points us toward the power that cultivating the virtue of intellectual humility can have on learning, specifically the motivation to learn and using effective learning strategies to further knowledge acquisition. What can human cognition tell us about intellectual humility? From developmental science, we might expect intellectual humility is rather a smooth process of assigning value to various ideas and theories about the world as experience dictates, leading us to the truth. However, it's not that simple. It appears that human beings are notoriously and apparently naturally disposed to overestimate their capacity to know the truth and underestimate their weaknesses. Furthermore, we're susceptible to all sorts of biases that make knowing difficult. For example, we tend to favor evidence or data received early in our inquiries, and we tend to discount the weight of evidence that counts against hypotheses we endorse. Second, evolutionary psychologists have offered some intriguing arguments that these dispositions are embedded within our cognitive structure in ways that we can systematically be led to biased thinking, in some cases for adaptive reasons. We have developed what are known as cognitive heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that allow us to quickly process information, which can lead to a more efficient decision-making. The downside to this efficiency, these heuristics, is they don't always help us track the truth. That is, they can lead to biased thinking. Cognitive science has come a long way toward understanding the roots of these biases, how our cognitive system utilizes biases as a way to efficiently store and sort knowledge on which we base our actions. One clear discovery in cognitive science is that these biases govern our decisions and actions, and they are not always consciously held or analyzed. In fact, most of the time they're not. The evidence is pretty clear from cognitive science that our natural tendency is toward intellectual arrogance, not intellectual humility. There is an extensive body of research into how chronic and systemic biases can result from certain cognitive heuristics that speed processing. Out of this research into heuristics and biases has grown a number of what are called dual process theories of human cognition. While each theory has different names and different categories assigned to each process, these theories broadly share a distinction between fast, automatic, and intuitive processes, called type 1 processes, and slow, deliberative, and analytic processes known as type 2 processes. Research into type 1 and type 2 thinking is both relevant and impactful for the study of intellectual humility. The heuristics of type 1 thinking evaluate ideas from within one's own perspective and therefore favor ideas that are readily accessible, easily discerned, and conform to prior experience. Type 2 processing, though it is more deliberate, and usually analyzes what type 1 thinking offers, it can also favor what one already knows, believes, and intuits, even as it decouples from type 1 representations. While in many instances this self-reliant type 1 thinking is adequate, problems and biases arise when reliance on what one knows and what one intuits does not provide enough information or the right kind of information for the task, which in turn produces biased judgments. Many of these biases are well known and well documented. One of the best known is called the confirmation bias, which is the tendency to seek confirmation for opinions and beliefs already held to and to ignore disconfirming evidence. We see evidence of this in the way people seek information about political candidates, watching news networks that reflect their already existing political leanings. So how might we overcome these biases and exercise intellectual humility? Well, it takes some intentional effort. Certain habits and attitudes can help mitigate the natural intellectual arrogance that can result from the cognitive shortcuts we take to make our thinking more efficient. A few of these habits are rule-based thinking, that is, directing one's attention to processes, objective criteria, and rules of analysis like logic that can aid in reducing systematic biases. Accuracy and accountability can help us. Situations that call for accuracy and judgment promote slower and more deliberative thinking. And if we value accuracy and are held accountable for our conclusions, we tend to exhibit more intellectual humility. Perspective taking can also help. One aspect of an open and flexible thinking disposition that helps mitigate biases is the capacity to weigh evidence for and against a strongly held belief, including the opinions and beliefs of others who hold a position different from one's own. This requires a certain capacity for perspective taking, a movement from the focus on one's own thoughts to include the perceptions, thoughts, and ideas of others. Because intellectual humility is a virtue that requires effortful control, it seems that this virtue is mostly found in the conscious exercise of type 2 thinking, or more specifically, through the proper collaboration of type 1 and type 2 processes. Investigating ways to attenuate cognitive biases along the lines outlined here, and investigating the traits that appear to create a natural disposition toward intellectual humility would be fruitful areas of research. Just as habits play a role in cultivating any virtue, habits of the mind can bring about intellectual humility and other epistemic virtues. They serve to curb the vice of intellectual arrogance, even in the face of a cognitive system that can be prone to biased thinking. Perhaps our cognitive system is not in and of itself vicious, but it may take a conscious effort and virtuous habits of the mind not to make it so. Are some people born intellectually humble? From the foregoing discussion, we might conclude we're all doomed to intellectual arrogance. That is the universal experience, after all, given our cognitive biases, and only those who apply the effort can become intellectually humble. Yet we know from personality and social psychology that there are individual differences among people concerning the traits, like open-mindedness and agreeableness, that lend themselves to more intellectually humble person. Moreover, a person might be intellectually humble about some topics, but quite dogmatic about others. Let's say you're very open-minded to different political arguments, but very close-minded when it comes to religious convictions. Could you be characterized as an intellectually arrogant person? And sometimes we can be quite arrogant about an opinion in one circumstance, but more malleable in another. Let's say you had a strong opinion that spanking children is detrimental to their development, and said so in a group of like-minded parents. But you were silent about it when your in-laws told you that to spare the rod is to spoil the child. Would you be characterized as an intellectually diffident person? Intellectual humility has many trait-like qualities, but even traits can vary in their expression across situations. Personality psychologists are interested in individual differences between people regarding the relative expression of traits. In this way, the studies are often comparative, measuring how much a given trait influences an individual's thought and behavior compared to others who share the same trait. For example, when measured on the Big Five personality traits, that is extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness, individuals show high or low levels of each trait relative to other people. And each trait is orthogonal, that is, a high or low score on any one trait does not influence the score on other traits. Intellectual humility may or may not work in the same way. It may also have orthogonal characteristics relative to other character traits, such that, for example, being high in intellectual humility may not impact how high or low a person is on courage or persistence. Since we know a lot about personality from the Big Five model, we can use that model to understand intellectual humility. For example, we can imagine that high levels of openness to experience might correlate with high intellectual humility. Similar corollaries of intellectual humility might exist within some facets of agreeableness or conscientiousness, and even neuroticism, which measures emotional stability. There's an additional personality construct, a six-factor model, that includes honesty-humility as an additional factor. We might expect humility to correlate strongly with intellectual humility, but not completely, as they represent different constructs. There are other personality traits, such as a need for cognition, which is people's tendency to engage in and enjoy effortful cognitive activity, and the need for cognitive closure, which is characterized by a need to make decisions to have an issue closed, that might inform the study of intellectual humility. Those high in need for cognition, who enjoy engaging in thinking and learning, might be expected to be higher in intellectual humility. Intellectual humility might require a person to remain open to revising opinions and ideas, a task difficult for those high in need for cognitive closure. Now, there is some controversy in the field of social and personality psychology about the power of personality traits to influence behavior. People are not consistent in their behavior across situations. Perhaps you know someone who is shy in the situations you encounter them, say a classroom or an office. This person is reticent to speak up, not offering opinions very readily. Then you run into that person in a setting outside the classroom or office, say an athletic competition like a basketball game. Suddenly, that same quiet person is yelling at the referee, leading the cheers for the home team. Could this be the same person? The situation seems to be determining the behavior. It's important to study not only how traits make people behave in a certain way, but how people's perceptions of situations and their reactions to them make people behave in a certain way. Many situations might influence the expression of intellectual humility away from the virtuous mean and toward either end of the vicious spectrum, whether toward intellectual diffidence or intellectual arrogance. A number of recent studies with different methodological approaches have investigated the effect of situation on intellectual humility and its vicious counterpart, intellectual arrogance. The first approach is to focus on situations that affect either the perception or expression of intellectual arrogance across individuals, investigating what kinds of situations might increase intellectual humility in general. And the second approach is to measure the trait of intellectual humility in individuals and then test under which circumstances that trait is either more or less present. This approach is more interested in the person-by-situation interaction and asks the question, under what circumstances and in which situations do individuals show more or less intellectual humility? An example of the first approach was a study done by Gadu and Kyle of how searching the internet influences people to think that information they have access to is now a part of their own knowledge base and makes them more confident about what they know. Being on the internet, it appears, makes you think you're smarter than you really are. Researchers who take the second approach and study the interaction of personality and situation have looked at how people react in different situations, such as in the realms of politics versus the realm of religion. Even someone high in intellectual humility can react differently depending on the situation, showing more arrogance in one situation versus the other. So what are we to conclude? Is intellectual humility a stable, long-lasting trait, or blown about by the winds of the situation? The answer is yes. Both situation and trait influence the expression of intellectual humility and the interaction of the two. Therefore, developing measures to assess the relative disposition of intellectual humility in people is a necessary step to furthering our understanding of this important intellectual virtue. And then examining the situations that either promote or inhibit the expression of intellectual humility is also a critical line of investigation. Testing the trait of intellectual humility in various situations will yield critical knowledge of how intellectual humility plays out. A later line of research, the trait by situation interaction, may be the most informative in promoting conditions for more civil discourse, especially in the areas of disagreement. Learning how to exchange ideas in an intellectually humble way and the situations that might promote such exchange would make a positive impact on our society. How do emotions affect our ability to be intellectually humble? Because emotions play an important role in cognition in general, we have good reason to expect they'll play an important role in intellectual humility. Emotions help focus attention. They interrupt other behavioral and cognitive inputs. Emotions organize people toward goals, needs, and concern, and motivate people toward addressing those specific actions. Emotions can help guide decision-making. Emotions can also inhibit intellectual humility, overwhelming thought, and causing us to return to entrenched positions. For example, there is evidence that people bias or distort their perceptions and concepts and judgments to protect themselves from negative emotional states. Literature on terror management theory provides another interesting avenue of research regarding the way emotion biases cognition. Terror management theory holds that anxiety about one's death is managed, at least in part, by validating one's current cultural worldview, leaving people closed off to alternative worldviews. A natural place to study the role of emotion in intellectual humility is in the arena of disagreement. Of particular interest is the relational dynamics involved in disagreement as the occasion for the introduction of emotion into thought. And then when we disagree, studies show that there is a heightened physiological arousal. Our hearts beat faster and emotions flood our cognitive processes. The presence of another human being introduces the potential for emotional reactivity that can impact the way thoughts are both processed and presented. These emotional reactions can be unconscious, even based on past experience of relationships, going all the way back to attachment relationships of caregivers. Reddy and Wilson offer an intriguing suggestion that emotional reactivity can play a role in the exchange of ideas and impact intellectual humility because people consider ideas as possessions that are not peripheral but central to the self. And because of this, any threat to an idea or the knowledge one possesses is a threat to the self. Intellectual humility is difficult in such cases because defending ideas is conflated with self-defense. To acknowledge limitations of one's knowledge is difficult because it would be an admission of self-limitation. We see this playing out in the issue of climate change in the United States and in the world. Those who deny climate change do so often out of a sense that to make the changes necessary to combat climate change offers a threat to their way of life, and therefore they deny that humankind influences the climate. Without emotion, our ability to reason is impaired. Without reason, emotion lacks clear direction. Arguably, this kind of integration of head and heart is the mark of a virtuous person. A robust empirical understanding of intellectual humility is impossible without serious attention to emotion, including its motivational and adaptive functions, its influence on cognition, its interpersonal influences, and its regulation. Different strategies for facilitating intellectual humility in epistemic partners, either accessing and evoking their emotions or attempting to manage and control them, will depend on a number of factors, including the topic of conversation, the context, the emotional history between the interlocutors, various personality factors, their level of emotional arousal, the emotional content involved, etc. All of these factors may expand and inform a proper understanding of intellectual humility. In addition, the more we understand about the role of emotion in cognition, the better we will be able to understand intellectual humility and promote its practice. While emotion is a clear motivating factor in cognition, it can also cloud or distort the pursuit of epistemic goods. To practice an intellectual virtue, there must be enough emotion to motivate the pursuit of truth, enough reason to discern it. Moreover, since intellectual humility has both epistemic and social dimensions, appraising our emotions, regulating them, and having emotional intelligence will help in the social sphere where intellectual humility is practiced. Understanding the role of emotion in cognition may be especially important for the doxaxic view of intellectual humility. Since the central task is to properly value beliefs, status, and abilities, emotion will play a central role, since emotion informs value, which reason then discerns. Our understanding of the capacity to value the good will be better informed by understanding the interplay of emotion and cognition. How do we know who is intellectually humble? Any scientific study of a phenomenon will require that it can be measured. If the desire is simply to discover the existence of a phenomenon, some kind of measure is required. If we want to know the relative strength of a phenomenon, a measure is needed. If we want to assess the occurrence of a phenomenon in one case and compare it to an occurrence in another case, we need a standard of comparison, a measure. If we want to devise an intervention that will increase the presence of the desired phenomenon, we need a measure to know if the intervention worked, if an increase can be detected. And so it is with intellectual humility. In order to discover it in people, assess its relative strength, compare one person to another in it, and help promote and increase it in people, we need good measures. Measurement is a natural place for philosophy and science to meet. When psychologists are trying to operationalize a concept by devising test items that can measure any given construct, they have some theory in mind. Items or procedure for the measure are generated on the basis of a theory of the construct. In the case of intellectual humility, if you hold a doxastic account, items or procedures that measure the accuracy of tracking positive epistemic status would be the focus. If you take the Robertson-Woods account, measuring ego investment in epistemic beliefs would be the focus. Again, there's no requirement to pick one philosophical perspective in generating content validity. Folk theories of intellectual humility may also inform the content, as well as theories from cognitive science and other realms. In fact, most researchers sample broadly across theories, especially when attempting to devise a general or global measure of intellectual humility. We take the stance that intellectual humility is a complex psychological process involving both within-person and between-person dynamics. For this reason, measuring it should be approached through multiple methods, which might include self-report, but also reports of observers and some behavioral indicators. To have real-world validity, it should also reflect the three dimensions found in the folk conception of intellectual humility, that is, the epistemic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal dimensions. When looking at specific measures, it's good to keep in mind a folk proverb, "The devil is in the details." In order to understand how a researcher is operationalizing a concept, it's good to look at the specific items generated to cover that concept. When trying to understand the convergent and discriminant validity of a concept, it's good to look at the specific measures against which the new measure is being compared and what the specific correlations are. If the researcher has done an analysis that shows what value the measure might add in measuring a certain concept, that is, what the measure might explain about the concept over and above existing measures, which is called incremental validity, this is also good to know. What I'm encouraging here is intellectual humility, assessing the conclusion of a study by really understanding how intellectual humility was measured, and then holding or valuing these conclusions with proper firmness, depending on the validity of the measure. So in this brief introduction, it's my hope that you at least have the outlines of the psychological dimensions of intellectual humility and have a vision of how it might be studied through scientific means. We now dive into these dimensions in more detail.
It's easy to assume that intellectual humility is an intellectual virtue. But what is an intellectual virtue? In this lecture, Professor John Greco will be helping us answer that big question. Professor Greco is the Leonard and Elizabeth Eslick Chair in Philosophy at St. Louis University. He received his PhD from Brown University and his bachelor's from Georgetown. He's a leading expert in virtue epistemology and has published widely in virtue epistemology, epistemic normativity, skepticism, and Thomas Reid. He's also the editor of American Philosophical Quarterly.
Today I'm going to talk about virtue epistemology, and the lecture will be divided into 4 parts. In part 1, I'm going to talk about what is virtue epistemology, how should we understand this approach in epistemology, and also what are some of its advantages, why might this approach in epistemology be attractive. In part 2, I'm going to talk about two kinds of intellectual virtue. On the one hand, there are what virtue epistemologists call character virtues, and on the other hand, there are what we call faculty virtues. And it's important to get straight on this distinction, and so I'm going to talk about that in part 2. And then in part 3, we'll look at how the two kinds of virtue are related. And then finally in part 4, I want to talk about the particular virtue of intellectual humility and how it fits into the broader virtue theoretic framework. Okay, so part 1, what is virtue epistemology? Well, epistemologists tend to understand virtue epistemology on an analogy with virtue ethics, And so it's going to be important to just talk a little bit first about virtue ethics, and then we can talk about virtue epistemology as an analogy to that. So a little bit about virtue ethics. Well, ethics in general is concerned with various sorts of issues. So, for example, one main issue in ethics is what actions are right, or what is the nature of right action, what makes for right action. Another kind of question in virtue ethics is what sort of things are valuable, or what sort of things are worth having or worthy of pursuit. So, for example, if you ask what are the most valuable things in life, you might say money, you might say having nice things. Some people think it's experience various kinds of pleasure. Or maybe you might think education is valuable, reputation is valuable, maybe you think friends are valuable. So that's another sort of main question in ethics, what sorts of things are valuable. A third question is what makes for a good life, or a desirable life, or a life worth living. What does it mean to flourish or thrive as a human being? So that's sort of questions about what kind of life should I lead. What does a good life look like? And then finally, in ethics, we're concerned about what makes for a good person, or, in other words, what makes for a virtuous person. So what does that consist in? What does that look like? Now, different ethical theories tend to make one of these questions most fundamental. And then once you've got an answer to that fundamental question, whatever you think it is, then you can go on to answer the other questions by referring back to what you think is most fundamental. So, for example, in ethics, there are deontological theories, such as Immanuel Kant's theory, which tends to focus on the issue of right action. What makes a right action? Only when he's got the answer to that most important question does Kant then go on to talk about what's valuable, what kind of life should I lead, what kind of person should I be, or what makes for a good person. And these tend to be in terms of which actions are right. So, for example, a good life would be a life full of right action, understood in this Kantian way. Now, consequentialist theories, such as Mill's utilitarianism, they make the question of what's most valuable the fundamental question. So, what things in life are most valuable, and then you can understand something like right action in terms of, well, the right action is the thing that promotes that which is most valuable, or a good life is that which contains many valuable things. So you get the idea that the fundamental question is then on value, and then goes on to answer the other questions in terms of value. Okay, well, that brings us to virtue theory. As you can imagine, virtue theories focus on the question of what makes for a virtuous person. So they're going to make that question about what makes a virtuous person. That's going to be the fundamental question. And then we're going to go on to answer questions about right action, a good life, what things are valuable in terms of the answer we give to the virtue question. So, for example, we could understand a right action as roughly the sort of action that a virtuous person would perform in the circumstances. Or we could understand a good life as a life that a virtuous person would lead, and which would have the sorts of things that are necessary to lead a virtuous life, things like that. So what we're doing here is we're taking, with these different theories, we're taking different approaches to what you might think of as the direction of explanation. So, some theories think you make, for example, the notion of right action fundamental, and then you explain other things like what makes for a good person or what makes for a good life in terms of right action. Virtue theory makes the concept of a virtuous person fundamental, and then it attempts to explain other things like right action, a good life, valuable things in terms of a virtuous person. Okay, so that's virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is understood as taking that sort of direction of analysis or direction of explanation in a way that makes virtues fundamental. So now we can talk analogously about virtue epistemology. So consider various issues that are of concern in epistemology. We might ask, what makes a belief justified or reasonable or rational to hold? Actually, epistemologists usually want to make a distinction between rationality and reasonableness and justification, but for our purposes, let's say those are roughly in the same ballpark, the same sort of thing. And that's one set of question. And the question is, what makes a belief a good belief in the terms of being justified or reasonable or rational? But another kind of question would be, what sorts of things are intellectually valuable? So, for example, what sort of things should we pursue as intellectual beings? So you might say truth, you might say reasonableness, you might say knowledge, you might say wisdom. These are various candidates for epistemic or intellectual goods or values, and we might take that as fundamental. We could ask what makes for a good intellectual life, or what makes for intellectual flourishing, so to speak. What does that look like? Or finally, we could ask what's an intellectually virtuous person look like? What does that consist in? Again, as you can imagine, virtue epistemology is going to take that last question about what makes for an intellectually good or virtuous person as fundamental, and then it's going to try to understand intellectual goods, the intellectual properties of belief, these sorts of things, by referring back to our answer about what makes for intellectual virtue. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about in this first part of the lecture is some advantages of virtue epistemology. So in order to do that, consider one of the main questions of epistemology, which is, what is knowledge? What does knowledge consist in? And then consider the standard virtue epistemology approach to that question. Okay. So first, the question is, what is knowledge? And really behind that question is a question like, what is the difference between knowledge and mere opinion? Or what's the difference between knowledge and even mere true opinion? Because sometimes opinions are true, but they don't amount to knowledge. So we're trying to get at, what makes the difference? Okay. Now, a standard approach to this question in virtue epistemology is to say the following. In cases of knowledge, you've got three things. One, your belief is true, because you can't know something unless you're right about it, that you're thinking about it correctly, so your belief has to be true. Secondly, your belief is virtuously formed, so it wasn't just a lucky guess, it wasn't just wishful thinking or something like that, but it was virtuously formed. You formed it in the right way. And then thirdly, in cases of knowledge, it's going to be the case that your belief is true because it's virtuously formed. So the idea is that it's true and it's virtuously formed, but those aren't just sort of two accidental features. It's that you got it right because you were virtuous in the way you approached the question, in the way that you formed your belief. So in this sense, knowledge is the product, so to speak, of intellectual virtue. And again, there are variations on this theme, but that's sort of standard approach. Even this very general approach already has some pretty significant advantages. So one advantage is that it gives you a very clear understanding of the way that knowledge is opposed to, say, something like a lucky guess or otherwise just mere luckily true belief. Is just the same distinction as the difference between virtuous success and mere lucky success in general. So very generally, we make a distinction between success that is the result of virtue, the success that is the result of virtuous or excellent agency, and success which is just mere lucky success. Basically, the virtue epistemologists are going to say that knowledge just fits into that framework. It's an example of virtuous success, and it's in that sense that it's opposed to mere lucky success, in this case, mere lucky true belief. Now, this same approach also explains what's known as the value problem in epistemology. It gives you a nice answer to the value problem. So the value problem goes back to Plato's Meno, where Plato is assuming that knowledge is different from mere lucky truth. But now the question he raises is, well, why do we value knowledge over mere true belief or luckily true belief? From a certain perspective, really what you want is to have true belief. So what does it matter whether you got it through knowledge or you got it through luck? So the value problem is, why do we value knowledge over mere true belief, or why is knowledge more valuable than mere true belief? For example, in sports, you'd rather win the game through skill and succeed that way through an exercise of your own skills as an athlete than to win the game because you just got lucky. Maybe your opponents just made terrible mistakes, or your opponent got sick and had to concede defeat. I mean, that's not as valuable. We're not going to value that sort of success like we value it when we win the game due to our own skills or abilities. So there's this very general approach that human beings take, is that we value success due to our own excellent agency over success that we get some other way. We can now explain the value of knowledge just in exactly those terms. Knowledge is a kind of success from intellectual excellence, success from intellectual ability or agency, and that's better than just getting it right by luck. Okay. A third advantage of virtue epistemology, I think, is that it is psychologically realistic. And what I mean by that is that it accords well with what our cognitive sciences tell us is the way that the human mind works, and that the way that human thinking works. So maybe one of the most important ways in which that comes out is that from a virtue theoretic perspective, there are many sources of knowledge because there are many intellectual virtues. And different kinds of knowledge, say moral knowledge, perceptual knowledge, scientific knowledge, all these different knowledge of other persons, that's another important one. All these different kinds of knowledge, we can say, require different kinds of virtues. Another way to put it is that there are different sources of these different kinds of knowledge, and a virtue theoretic framework can accommodate that very well. And as it turns out, cognitive science tells us that perceptual processing and the way we get at perceptual truths is very different from, say, mathematical reasoning and the way that we prove mathematical theorems. It's just a different kind of thing going on. So if you're going to understand the excellence or what excellent perception looks like, you don't want to use a model for what excellent mathematical reasoning looks like. And so a virtue theoretic approach allows us to accommodate that idea very nicely. Okay, another advantage of virtue epistemology would be very much related to this last one we were talking about, and that is that we get nice answers to traditional skeptical worries. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I just want to give you a feel for how this might work. So now, plausibly, many of the skeptical arguments in the history of philosophy, and in other words, arguments that try to push us to the conclusion that we don't know some things. So we don't know the external worlds of physical objects, so we can't know other people's minds. Some skeptical arguments argue that we can't know anything at all. But what drives a lot of those skeptical arguments is this one model fits all notion that all knowledge is based on a kind of reasoning analogous to, say, the reasoning involved in mathematical proof. And once you're in that mode and you're saying, look, you have knowledge only if you have a proof that looks like this, now when you don't find a proof that looks like that, you're going to be driven to the skeptical conclusion. So when you broaden out and get a more psychologically realistic understanding about how the human mind works, and you reject that model that tries to fit everything into the mathematical reasoning box, for example, that's going to rob the skeptical arguments of what was driving them in the first place. It's going to rob them of this first assumption, which is that you have knowledge only if it looks like this. Once you say, well, knowledge can look all different kinds of ways, there's now you just don't have the burden of showing that your knowledge looks like this, and a lot of the skeptical worries just evaporate at this point. Okay, a lot more to be said there, but that's sort of the general spirit of the kind of anti-skeptical spirit of virtue epistemology. Virtue epistemologists have conceived of intellectual virtues in two relatively distinct ways, and so I want to talk about that a bit too, and get a feel for that and what's involved there. Now, the best way to get at these two kinds of intellectual virtue, I think, is to go back to Aristotle and Aristotle's views, and many virtue epistemologists go back to Aristotle in various ways. He's a kind of father of virtue theoretic approaches in both ethics and epistemology. One of the founding fathers, anyway. So on Aristotle's view, there were two categories of virtue. There were, on the one hand, moral or practical virtues, which are excellences regarding action. And then on the other hand, there were intellectual virtues or excellences regarding thinking and judgment. And it's important to note here that the Greek word that we're translating as virtue really could also be translated as excellence. So when we in English hear the word virtue, we tend to think moral virtue. But what Aristotle meant by virtue was simply excellence. And basically what he was saying is there are moral or practical excellences, and then there are intellectual excellences. And he thought that these looked very different. So with respect to moral virtues or virtues that are tied to action, he thought of these as what you might think of as character traits or personality traits. So an example would be the moral virtue of courage, or let's say a moral virtue of temperance, or being temperate in the way you approach pleasures, something like that. So these are different personality traits or character traits which help you to negotiate the realm of action, so to speak. Now, two salient characteristics of these moral virtues for Aristotle was, one, first, they were the result of habituation. They were the result of doing things right over and over again, and then eventually you would form the habit of doing things a certain way, and it's really this habit which is the virtue. So, for example, take a courageous person. How do you get to be courageous? Well, in Aristotle's view, you get to be courageous by doing courageous things. So at first it might be difficult to do a courageous thing, but the more you do it, the better you get at it, and the easier it becomes, until it becomes a kind of habit for you, and you can do it more automatically, you can do it more easily. And so the courageous person is someone who through courageous action, has learned to be a courageous person. So it's not just a trait of the action, it's now a trait of the person. Another salient characteristic of Aristotle's moral virtues is that they involve deliberate choice. They involve a kind of willfulness where the virtuous person makes the right choices. The courageous person makes the right choices with respect to danger. The temperate person makes the right choices with respect to pleasure or other temptations. And in fact, these virtues could be thought of as habits of choice or habits of will. And by virtue of being habits of choice or will, they're also habits of action, because, of course, what you're choosing is how to act. Okay. Now, Aristotle thought of intellectual virtues or intellectual excellences in a different way. These he thought of more like intellectual faculties or powers. So, for example, he thought one kind of intellectual excellence was a kind of insight into first truths, or the most basic truths of reality. And then another kind of intellectual excellence was the power of reasoning, which allowed us to move from these first truths to figure out other important things. Another example of an intellectual faculty or power, which would count as a virtue for Aristotle, would be insight into what things are good or what things are valuable. A certain kind of intellectual virtue gives you a kind of insight into that domain. These don't necessarily involve habituation. They might, but that's not sort of characteristic of them. Neither do they necessarily involve choice or will. Again, they might, but that's not necessarily characteristic of them. Now, when contemporary epistemology first came on the scene, there was early on a debate about the nature of intellectual virtues. And the debate was really about whether Aristotle was right to divide virtues into two categories. Was Aristotle right that intellectual virtues should be conceived as powers or faculties, as opposed to moral virtues, which are conceived as character traits or personality traits? Or should we think of intellectual virtues more like he was thinking of character virtues? So could we think of, say, intellectual courage or intellectual fairness, intellectual carefulness? These would be traits which it was argued look quite like Aristotle's moral virtues. They are sort of character traits or personality traits. They might involve deliberate choice and habituation in the way that Aristotle's moral virtues do. And so some virtue epistemologists argued that, that's the way we should think of intellectual virtues, really on the model of Aristotelian moral virtues. Whereas other virtue epistemologists argued that, no, Aristotle was right, that moral excellences are different from intellectual excellences, and it's best to think of intellectual virtues as powers or faculties. And I think nowadays there's some consensus that that was probably a bad question, because there's no reason why we have to say, well, they're either like this or like that. We can easily embrace a kind of plurality of intellectual virtues. We can say, look, there's more than one kind of intellectual excellence. Some intellectual excellences are more like character traits, personality traits. So we might, under that category, say, look, it's one way of being excellent is to be intellectually careful, or to be intellectually fair, or to be intellectually open-minded. Things like this, maybe intellectually courageous even. These are perfectly well conceived as intellectual excellences and therefore intellectual virtues. But right alongside that, we can say there are other kinds of intellectual excellence as well. So acute perception, or sound reasoning, or reliable memory. These are also, now talking in the terms of cognitive abilities or intellectual abilities or powers, but they're also a kind of excellence in the intellectual realm. You could be better or worse at these things. These are things that can be evaluated as excellent or falling short of excellence. And so we just really have two kinds of intellectual excellence, or two kinds of intellectual virtue. So again, the old debate, which you might see in some of the readings or whatever, the old debate about, what is an intellectual virtue? Is it this or that? I think it's better to just leave that debate behind and just recognize that there are two kinds of intellectual virtue. In part 3 of the lecture, I want to talk about how character virtues and faculty virtues are related. I want to suggest that the character virtues can contribute to the faculty virtues by making them function better. So insofar as the faculty virtues have the function of getting us at the world, they get us truths and hopefully knowledge in different domains of reality, it's plausible that the character virtues can actually help the faculty virtues to function better in that respect. So to get a feel for how that might go, I want to first make a distinction that we make in epistemology, which is between reliability of a faculty and the power of a faculty. So reliability is a matter of the ratio between true beliefs and false beliefs. So for example, excellent perception is highly reliable in the sense that it almost always delivers true beliefs and almost never false beliefs about, say, mid-size physical objects under proper perceptual conditions. So reliability is not infallibility. It's not that perception can never lead us wrong, but perception is highly reliable in that it almost never leads us wrong. It's going to give us a high ratio of true beliefs over false beliefs. Now, power is a different notion. Power is a matter of how many true beliefs a faculty delivers. Next thing to see then is that reliability and power can come apart. And in fact, there's often a trade-off between reliability and power. So, for example, you might have a perceptual faculty that's highly reliable, but with very poor power. So you might be the person, you could imagine a person, for example, who is extremely careful about any judgments they make about an object's shape. So they refuse to make a judgment about the object's shape until they get to go all the way around the object and look very carefully, and then they'll say, oh, that's a cube. Or they might do the same thing and decide, oh, well, this is a sphere. Now, that person presumably is going to have extremely reliable perception because they're being so careful it's going to be very hard for them to ever make a mistake. But they're going to have poor power with their reception because they're going to get very few true beliefs. I mean, they're just not going to just rely on the normal perceptual cues that we can tell a cube from a sphere without walking all the way around it and making absolutely sure about the shape. Okay, so that's the way then where you can have very high reliability, but at the cost of power. You can also have great power, but at the cost of poor reliability. So that's fairly easy to imagine as well. So, for example, if you were just extremely trusting of your perceptual faculties and you're ready just to believe perceptual appearances as soon as you get them without ever checking, well, you'd get a lot more true beliefs because the perceptual faculties are going to be delivering you a lot of truth, but you're going to make more mistakes as well. And so you're going to have an increase in power, but a decrease in reliability. So now, presumably, intellectual excellence with respect to our faculty virtues is going to involve a good balance between reliability and power. So, and now we can make the point I was getting to, which is that the character virtues can contribute to both the reliability of our intellectual faculties and to the power of our intellectual faculties. And it can also contribute to achieving the right balance between reliability and power. So, for example, take the intellectual virtue, the intellectual character virtue of intellectual carefulness. Plausibly, intellectual carefulness will make our reasoning faculties more reliable. So if I'm careful about how I gather evidence, and I'm careful about how I make inferences from that evidence, I'm more likely to get things right, and therefore there will be an increase in the reliability of my reasoning powers. On the other hand, a character trait like intellectual courage will plausibly increase the power of a reasoning faculty, which is to say that it's possible to be too careful, too timid in the way, for example, that we reason in a domain. And as a result, we'll lose out on knowledge that we possibly could have if we were more courageous and willing to reason with a bit more courage. So now in part 4 of the lecture, I'm going to talk about intellectual humility. First, I want to ask, what is intellectual humility? What's the nature of intellectual humility? What does it consist in? And now there are competing views here, and you will hear more about those competing views in, I think, previous lectures and maybe future lectures as well. So I don't want to say anything very specific, but I think we can say some very general things about intellectual humility that hopefully nobody should disagree with. So first, one thing to note is that humility in general is opposed to pride, and so it makes sense to say that intellectual humility is opposed to intellectual pride. Now, some salient characteristics of pride are first, one who's prideful overestimates one's own abilities, which is to say that one overestimates one's limitations, and that often involves underestimating one's dependence on others. So if I'm a prideful person, I tend to think too much about my own contributions and not enough about other people's contributions. I might be overly confident about both what I'm doing and my ability to achieve things and what I'm actually achieving, and I might miss the value of the ways other people are contributing, and maybe miss the way that I'm actually depending on other people for whatever achievements whatever achievements I do make. So accordingly, now if we think of pride and humility that way, then intellectual humility will involve a more accurate assessment of one's own intellectual abilities and thus one's own intellectual limitations, and a more adequate understanding of the ways that one does and really should depend on others. So, in other words, depend on others intellectually. So, if that's the way we're thinking about intellectual humility, it seems fairly clear that we're making intellectual humility a character virtue, right? An excellence of character. We're putting it in that category. We can also say that intellectual humility, like other character virtues, can contribute to both the reliability and the power of our intellectual faculties. So, for example, intellectual humility will plausibly raise the reliability of reasoning and our reasoning faculties much in the way that carefulness did. So, insofar as intellectual humility opposes intellectual overconfidence or arrogance, then it makes sense that the humble person might be inclined to, for example, gather more evidence or seek out counter evidence to what they presently believe, rather than just being satisfied with their own present opinion without further investigation or without proper investigation. Now, perhaps less obviously, but I think you can see this once you think about it, intellectual humility can also contribute to the power of our intellectual faculties. It can help us to get more true beliefs across a greater variety of circumstances and a greater variety of domains. So this will be the case insofar as an intellectually humble person is less likely to be overly self-reliant, to insist on doing everything oneself. In other words, an intellectually humble person is more likely to appropriately rely on others. So there are different ways in which we do rely on others, and appropriately so, in the intellectual domain. So one of the most obvious ways is the function of testimony to, in a sense, share knowledge with each other. So we often appropriately rely on testimony to know things that someone else is in a better position to know than we ourselves are. Someone who understands the importance of that sort of sharing, that sort of cooperation in the intellectual realm will, of course, increase the number of true beliefs and increase the amount of knowledge that's available to them by, in effect, exploiting the social resources that testimony makes available. So now a related way in which we depend on others is the use of experts. So in the intellectual realm, as in the practical realm, we benefit from a kind of division of labor. And we benefit when some people are more expert than others in a certain domain, so long as we're willing to take advantage of that expertise and to use it when it's appropriate to do so. So again, that's another way to increase the power. Remember, power is a matter of multiplying or increasing the number and variety of true beliefs, the range of our knowledge, and experts help us to do that so long as we're willing to depend on them. Similarly, with the deference to authority. Now, some people might think that it's never proper to defer to someone on an intellectual matter, but of course, that's an over value there on self-reliance. We defer to people in the intellectual realm all the time, and rightfully so. And so, for example, I'm going to defer to the authority of my doctor on certain facts about medicine. I'm going to defer to the authority of my lawyer on certain legal questions. Now, that doesn't mean to defer to people blindly or unreflectively. You can do it well or you can do it poorly, but that's what character virtues are about. Finally, another kind of social epistemic dependence that a appropriately humble person will be open to is a kind of intellectual cooperation in groups. So we often think about individuals as trying to achieve some knowledge or get some insight into a domain all by themselves, but as we said, human beings are social animals. It's often the case that we work together, that we cooperate in some kind of inquiry together in some sort of team. So scientific inquiry gives us a good example of this. It's very rare nowadays to have a lone scientist doing her experiments by herself outside some sort of broader team. So the conclusion is appropriate intellectual humility can have tremendous payoff in terms of increased power. It's not only going to increase reliability, but it's going to increase power as well. I want to end the lecture by just raising one more issue. So this is an unadvertised part 5. I want to end by asking a question about intellectual humility that maybe doesn't get raised so often, but I think it's a good question. So one thing that I think is true about the literature is that it's dominated by a question about what makes an individual intellectually virtuous. And the implicit assumption behind that question is a kind of one model fits all assumption. So when you ask, what does a virtuous person look like? The implicit assumption maybe is that all virtuous persons are going to look the same. And so, we get that in virtue ethics as well, where we're asking what does a morally virtuous person look like? And we're trying to describe some ideal of a morally virtuous person. Well, we might be looking at a kind of single ideal for an intellectually virtuous person. But suppose we take seriously that we are social beings in the intellectual realm as well as the practical realm, and suppose we take seriously the idea that much of important intellectual inquiry goes on in the context of teams of inquirers working together. Well, then we might be less concerned about what does a virtuous individual look like, and more concerned about what does an individual team look like. What does a virtuous intellectual community look like? And once you ask that question, it's very plausible that an intellectually virtuous team is one that is not monolithic in terms of the makeup of its individuals. So it might be that an intellectually virtuous team is going to have quite a variety in the character and in the intellectual virtues of its individual members. So, for example, if you've got a scientific team up and running, you might want some people who are extremely careful about the details, and just really that's where they excel, whereas you might want other people who are more creative, who are less risk averse, and are willing to float maybe more risky hypotheses. You want some people who are more timid, some who are more bold, some who are more creative, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just to raise the question about whether, the assumption that we should really be concerned about the virtue of individuals, or that we should just be concerned about the intellectual virtues of individuals. Maybe a different perspective might make us more concerned about the intellectual virtues of teams or groups working together, and open up the possibility that we really don't want everyone to be of the same intellectual character. The group might benefit by more variety in the character traits or in the different kinds of excellences that different individuals might possess. I want to end this section by talking about two ways to characterize virtue epistemology, which I think are misleading. So again, it goes back to, let's say some of us are more interested in the character virtues, intellectual virtues conceived as character virtues, intellectual courage, open-mindedness, fairness. Others are interested in the faculty virtues, conceived as acute perception or sound reasoning or something like that. So one way in which these two camps are sometimes described is responsibilist versus reliabilist. And the idea is that the people who are concerned with character virtues, they're really concerned with questions about intellectual responsibility or epistemic responsibility. And so we should think of them as virtue responsibilists. Whereas the people who are concerned with faculty virtues or powers, they're really concerned with questions about reliability, where reliability has something to do with, we'll talk about this more later, but reliability has to do with how well you're getting at the truth. And so that's a natural way to understand our cognitive faculties, is in terms of how they're getting us at the truth and how well they're doing that. I think this is a misleading way to divide up the field and what people are doing. The reason it's misleading, I think, is because if you're interested in epistemic responsibility and character virtues, it's not as if questions about reliability are now irrelevant. One reason we're interested in the character virtues is not just because we're interested in what makes us responsible believers, but it's also what makes us reliable believers. Presumably, someone who is intellectually arrogant, for example, is going to be less reliable to someone who is more appropriately epistemically humble. So it's not as if the reliable question and the reliability question, the responsibility questions can be divorced from each other. Same thing happens in the other camp. It's true that when we're thinking about knowledge, we want to know, well, are we reliably getting at truth in a certain domain? But again, you can't just separate reliability from responsibility, because one of the main ways we're going to be reliable is that we act responsibly. So irresponsible behavior in the intellectual domain is going to undermine reliability in the intellectual domain. So it's not as if you can just that's a good way to divide the field. The second way that people characterize the field, which again I think is somewhat misleading, is to make a distinction between internalist virtue epistemology and externalist virtue epistemology. That's kind of a technical notion, but I think it's important to have some kind of feel for it, just because you might encounter this terminology if you do more reading in virtue epistemology. So if you're talking about what makes a belief justified, or what makes a belief rational, or what makes a belief epistemically responsible, for example, an internalist is going to try to answer those questions only by referring to what is going on inside the head, so to speak, what the believer can sort of understand about herself. So if I'm justified, I should be able to tell whether I'm justified or whether I have the goods for being justified just by considering things like what evidence I have, or what my experiences are like, or something like that. An externalist is going to say a certain epistemic standing or epistemic value in question really requires more than that. It's not just about what's going on inside the head, or what's going on that I can just reflect on. It might have to do with how I'm hooked up to the world, what relationship I have with other people, what kind of causal mechanisms are involved in, say, my interaction with the world. These are all things that are sort of facts outside my head, facts which I can't know just by reflecting on what's going on the inside, but they're facts about what's going on the outside. So hence externalists think that those sorts of facts are important. Internalists think that only the internal facts are the important facts for figuring out these epistemological issues. So some people talk about internalist virtue epistemology, and they say, look, the people who are concerned with character virtues, they're really internalists. The character virtue epistemologists are just about what's going on the inside, whereas the people who are talking about faculty epistemology and how our faculties are getting at the world, they're externalists. Well, I guess that's right as far as it goes, but I think it's a misleading way of characterizing things, because if you ask questions about intellectual character, again, character has to do with habit, which has to do with past performance. It has to do with causal dispositions of how you respond to the world, etc. These are all externalist features, and so the character virtue epistemologists can't be concerned only with what's going on inside the head, so to speak. Part of a person's character speaks to how they're interacting with the world, and so brings in external factors. Similarly, on the faculty side, certainly external factors about our mind-world relation, for example, are important when we're talking about, are our faculties functioning properly, or are they functioning reliably, etc. But internal factors, what's going on inside the head, are not going to be just irrelevant. So you can't really talk interestingly about perception, or about memory, or about what excellent perception involves, what excellent memory involves, what excellent reasoning for that matter involves, by just ignoring what's accessible to the knower, or the believer. So just as character virtue epistemologists are going to be concerned with both internalist and externalist considerations, so are faculty epistemologists going to be concerned with both internalist and externalist considerations. And so again, I think it's just misleading to divide the field that way, as if, character is all about internalist factors and faculty is all about externalist faculties. So I think the better way to sort of divide up the field is really just to recognize that there are two kinds of intellectual excellence, or intellectual virtue. There are character virtues, there are faculty virtues, and then we can ask, what are they good for? Which kinds of questions, which kinds of issues are they going to help us with? And we can use these different theoretical resources as they're available to help us where they can help us. We can also ask how these two kinds of intellectual virtue are related to each other. That's the topic of part 3.
Before we can encourage or facilitate personal growth and intellectual humility, we need to know how such a virtue can be identified and empirically measured in people. In this lecture, Professor Peter Hill will be discussing some of his research on the measurement of intellectual humility and helping us answer the big question, how do we know who is intellectually humble? Professor Hill earned his PhD in social psychology from the University of Houston, and he is a professor of psychology at the Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University. Professor Hill is an active researcher in social psychology and the psychology of religion, where he has authored approximately 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters.
In the next few lectures, we're going to be focusing on the measurement of humility, be it intellectual humility or otherwise. You want answers, you can't handle the truth. Some of you know where that line came from. It was one of the most famous lines in movie lore, uttered by Colonel Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson in the 1992 movie A Few Good Men. Now, the movie itself is now dated, and the storyline as well as the portrayal of Jessup may be forgotten. But many who saw the movie may recollect that Jessup was anything but a paragon of humility. Believing that he only was capable of handling the truth, combined with an unwillingness to acknowledge his own limitations as a military leader, nor able to admit his preoccupation with status. Jessup's lack of humility is easily noted by even the most novice observer of human behavior. However, not everyone's humility, or lack thereof, is so easily discerned. So, we are left with a fundamental question. How do we determine whether or not a person is humble, whether it be intellectual humility or otherwise? Now, of course, in everyday human relationships, we may carry around with us a rough notion of what humility is and how it may be manifested in people. And that may work just fine for most of us. But if we really want to understand humility, what it is, what are its effects on human relationships? What is its importance in providing leadership to others? To what extent does it influence how we treat others? And just a multitude of other questions. These questions, like this, will require systematic research effort. Such efforts have been slow in science, in part due to concerns about our ability to measure humility. But this is changing, and in the next few lectures, we will review some of the attempts to measure humility. The focus here is primarily on intellectual humility. However, we will spend some of our time talking about humility as a general construct, for this is what most of the research to date has focused upon. Before addressing the measurement question, however, I will first present a brief overview of what humility is and what it is not. Now, I know you've already heard a lot about humility, especially intellectual humility. And so some of what I will say is redundant with what you have already heard. However, I want to discuss humility from the perspective of researchers who had in mind the task of measuring the concept. After all, good measurement requires good conceptualization of the construct being measured. Now, in broad strokes, we can think of humility as a renunciation of self-serving thoughts and attitudes, with a corresponding increased respect and appreciation for the value of others. What some psychologists have referred to as a hypoegoic mindset. As such, humble individuals lack an emotional egocentrism and maintain a low degree of self-centeredness. They are able to accurately acknowledge personal finiteness, including limitations or mistakes. This does not mean, however, that humility is characterized by such common misperceptions as timidity, weakness, or incapability. You see, humility, properly understood, requires a sense of security and enduring personal worth, and therefore provides a foundation that has important psychological implications for self-acceptance, for a proper recognition of strengths and limitations, for an ability to respond without preconceived biases to others' ideas and advice, even if it's contrary to one's own views, for a freedom from relying on social comparison processes motivated by a concern for social status. All of these implications require a strong, secure sense of self. In the words of psychologist Everett Worthington, humility is the quiet virtue. Humility as a virtue lurks in the background. It does not grab headlines. It does not require center stage. This may be one reason why humility has not received the attention of researchers. It flies below the radar screen. As an underlying disposition, humility is comprised of multiple dimensions and is not defined exclusively by just one characteristic. For example, the psychologist June Tangney wrote a seminal article in 2000, and it was later updated in 2009, where she identified 6 components of humility. And notice just how different her profile is from a common lay understanding. Here are her 6 components. The first is a willingness to see the self accurately. Second, an accurate perspective of one's place in the world. Third, an ability to acknowledge personal mistakes and limitations. Fourth, an openness to new understandings and experiences. Fifth, a low self-focus. And finally, an appreciation of the value of all things. So humility is multidimensional, and the measures that we will soon review reflect this reality. What is clear from theory and research is that humility is generally conceived as involving both intra, within the self, and interpersonal components. Humility reflects dynamics that are going on within the self that also involve the capacity to relate to others in fruitful and constructive ways. One topic of interest to researchers is whether or not subdomains of humility, such as intellectual humility, but also other subdomains, such as spiritual humility, cultural humility, or even relational humility, are actually derived from a central character trait of humility. This question will likely be answered over time by the extent to which these different subdomains are associated. But to answer this question will require that we develop subdomain measures. So in our next lecture, we will zero in on the subdomain of intellectual humility. Truth be told, however, whether we are talking about humility as a general characteristic or in terms of any of these subdomains, empirical research is in its early stages, and we may find that we will have to adjust our conception of humility. Large parts of it have yet to be empirically tested. The empirical work to be done requires reliable and valid measures of humility. In this lecture, we're going to talk about a conceptualization of intellectual humility. Intellectual humility applies the concept of humility to epistemic issues, namely the extent to which the person acknowledges limitations of his or her beliefs or knowledge. Humility is, according to many philosophers, an intellectual virtue. In the context of virtue epistemology, which focuses on the processes by which beliefs are formed, the question has arisen among philosophers regarding the extent to which intellectual virtues, such as intellectual humility, are necessary even to the very foundation and advancement of knowledge. Scholars, whether they be philosophers or psychologists, or for that matter, other disciplines such as theology, have different perspectives of what is meant by intellectual humility. My purpose is not to argue for one position over another, as much as it is to simply lay out the possibilities that should be considered in the development of measures. One account is that of the philosopher Julia Driver, who argues that intellectual humility is indeed holding oneself in low regard, to underestimate self-worth to some extent, in spite of the available evidence. We can call this the low self-worth perspective. And though I'm trying to be balanced in my presentation of the various options, I do think that this position has serious limitations, and I'm not aware of any current measures of intellectual humility that reflect just this perspective. Another account, offered by Peter Samuelson and his colleagues, maintains that intellectual humility consists in proper belief. Intellectual humility is, in their terms, believing as one ought, believing with the firmness the given belief merits. Of course, it is a complex issue in determining the merit of a belief, and these authors try to spell out how this is best accomplished. We will refer to this as the proper belief understanding of intellectual humility. Yet a third perspective has been offered by philosophers Robert Roberts and Jay Wood. Their definition of intellectual humility has drawn considerable philosophical interest. They say that it's an unusually low dispositional concern for the kind of self-importance that accrues to persons who are viewed by their intellectual communities as intellectually talented, skilled, and accomplished, especially where such concern is muted by or sidelined by intrinsic intellectual concerns. In particular, the concern for knowledge with its various attributes of truth, justification, warrant, coherence, precision, load-bearing, and so forth. Now, according to Roberts and Wood, intellectual humility may be especially important for those who are viewed by their communities as intellectually talented. Though communities may differ in terms of the salience of the intellectual domain, for example, academia in contrast to professional sports, leaders emerge often on the basis of intellectual ability and prowess that has the potential to exert disproportionate influence over group ideas. For them, intellectual humility and other types of humility as well can be thought of in terms of motivation. In this case, a high concern for knowledge and its various attributes, and a low concern for status or self-importance. We can call this the low concern for status perspective. A concern for accurate knowledge requires that a person be aware of and willing to acknowledge and own the limitations of his or her beliefs, knowledge, or system of thinking. The owning limitations perspective has been championed by Dennis Whitcomb and colleagues. So we minimally have 4 views of intellectual humility: low self-worth, proper belief, low concern for status, and owning limitations. Only the latter 3 of which seem to be gaining much traction in the literature. Common to the latter 3 positions, proper belief, low concern for status, and owning limitations, is that intellectual humility should be thought of as a motivational characteristic. And at the heart of the motivational drive is a deep, overriding, intrinsic concern for knowledge. Knowledge for its own sake, as an end in itself, and not as a means to some other end. It is this primary motivation to which all other motivations pale in comparison. Through such an overriding concern for knowledge, 3 primary characteristics or components of intellectual humility can be identified. First, a willingness to hold beliefs tentatively, to the extent that one is willing to revise one's perspective given a convincing reason to do so. Second, a willingness to undertake a critical scrutiny of one's perspective, including a balanced consideration of evidence that both supports and refutes one's perspective. And third, a willingness to acknowledge that equally sincere, capable, and knowledgeable individuals may reasonably hold different views. An individual who is intellectually humble will remain curious, open-minded, and cognitively flexible because he or she acknowledges and accepts the limits on his or her knowledge and perspective of the world. Just as with humility in general, acceptance of limits can foster an attitude by which one is willing to seek new knowledge and accept feedback, including critical feedback from others. The intellectually humble person is able to maintain his or her perspective, but is always open to revising it, while simultaneously respecting and valuing others' views, even when such views are opposed to his or her own views. Now, this is not to say that the intellectually humble are without bias. No person can be totally free of bias, and there are times when sticking to one's guns, even if biased, may be effective and turn out to be accurate. Consider the cases of Copernicus and Einstein, for example. However, the basis of the bias does matter. Intellectual humility posits that bias should not be derived from a desire for social status or a refusal to accept one's intellectual limits, but rather that intellectual endeavors be pursued in the service of outcomes beyond motivated self-interest. Intellectual humility can be applied to a variety of domains, including academia, organizational life, and civil discourse. Intellectual humility, if better understood and successfully fostered, should have wide-ranging social benefits in a culture where ideological diversity and plurality are frequently valued in principle, but rarely practiced. So, in review, when viewed within a motivational framework, intellectual humility involves pursuing knowledge more for the sake of knowledge than for any other reason. As an intellectually humble individual pursues the epistemic goals of knowledge and understanding, he or she will be primarily concerned with the development of wisdom and knowledge, as opposed to seeking knowledge for prestige, admiration from others, or general self-enhancement. To develop a measure of intellectual humility is no small task, but it is a necessary task if we are to develop an empirically based understanding. And so, in the next few lectures, we will turn our attention to issues of measurement. In this lecture, we're going to look at measuring humility more as a general construct than specifically intellectual humility. As mentioned in the last lecture, a group of colleagues and I recently reviewed the literature, and we found 16 measures that we believe are good measures of humility. Most of the measures are published and are currently in use by researchers. Many of these measures look at humility as a general characteristic and are not specifically measures of intellectual humility. Some, however, are designed specifically with intellectual humility in mind, and I will be sure to emphasize these measures in particular in the next lecture. There is no way that I can provide, in a couple of brief lectures, an exhaustive review of all 16 measures that we found. Furthermore, the field is rapidly expanding, and much effort is currently underway in developing even more new measures, some of which I don't even know much about. So here I will provide only a brief description of some of the measures. Now, measurement is not the most exciting topic. Believe me, I know this. I've spent a good portion of my career focusing on issues of measurement, and perhaps that tells you something about how exciting my life is. But good measurement is absolutely vital for scientific progress. Before I mention some specific measures, let me explain what I mean by saying that these are good measures. As you may recall from the previous lecture, measurement in psychology often involves reports. And as I mentioned in that lecture, for better or worse, these reports are usually self-reports of multiple items. Measurement of anything in psychology, including humility, must meet acceptable scientific standards in terms of two basic psychometric considerations: reliability and validity. Reliability is the extent to which a scale is consistent in its measurement. If you are a humble person today, then you will likely be a humble person 2 weeks from now, all things being equal. A measure should show such consistency. There are several ways to determine a scale's reliability. The most common is called Cronbach's alpha, and it's an indicator of the extent to which the scale's items are measuring the same thing. But sometimes we do measure consistency over time. We call that test-retest reliability, and it's frequently around 2 weeks apart that we tend to administer the tests. A scale's validity is the extent to which a scale actually measures what it is intended to measure. Validity is often determined by the correlation between a given scale and some other standard or measure, the extent to which a given scale correlates with measures of related constructs. In the case of humility, we might expect it to correlate closely with a measure of modesty. And if it does, we say that there is convergent validity. We might also expect it to negatively correlate with a measure of narcissism. And this too is a notion of convergent validity. Sometimes we expect a given scale to not be correlated with a measure to which it should be independent, and we refer to that as divergent validity. For example, a measure of humility we would expect to be unrelated to a measure of extroversion. There are minimal criteria for determining if a scale is sufficiently reliable and valid, and that is beyond our concern here. For our concern, all of the scales reported here show good reliability and validity. So now we are going to look at 3 self-report measures of humility as a general dispositional characteristic. The first measure that we're going to look at is called the honesty humility subscale. And it's a subscale of a 6-factor personality inventory that's called Hexaco. Now, the word Hexaco is an acronym where each letter refers to some aspect of personality. And the H in Hexaco is the one that refers to honesty and humility. And the honesty-humility subscale of this personality inventory is among the first and most widely used measures of dispositional humility. It is a 10-item measure that consists of 4 components: sincerity, fairness, greed avoidance, and modesty. Respondents rate each item on a 5-point Likert scale. Now, as a side note, you might sometimes hear that reported as a Likert scale. Now, I want to be intellectually humble here, but I do believe that the correct pronunciation is Likert. And the reason why I think that is that I happen to know a person now who's quite old, but who was a student of Dr. Likert. And he told me it should be pronounced Likert and not Likert. At any rate, some of the sample honesty-humility items include: I wouldn't use flattery to get a raise or promotion at work, even if I thought it would succeed. That would be an example item of the sincerity dimension. Or another example item: if I knew that I could never get caught, I would be willing to steal $1 million. Now that item is reverse scored. In other words, a person who agrees with that item is indicating a low sense of humility. And that is an example item of the greed avoidance scale. This scale, the scale overall, the honesty-humility scale, meets the criteria for good reliability and validity. But the combination of honesty and humility in the scale raises some questions about whether it is a good measure of humility as we have talked about it here. In fact, you may have been surprised by the 2 sample items provided here. However, it should be pointed out that people who score high on greed avoidance are not especially motivated by monetary or social status considerations, which, if you may recall, we thought of as a possibly important dimension of both intellectual humility and humility as a general construct. Similarly, high scorers on modesty view themselves as ordinary people without any claim to special treatment. So, there is certainly some overlap with our conception of humility. However, it is probably not the best available measure, even though it is the most widely used measure. Often, the first measure of a construct that is published is the one that gets the most action, regardless of whether it is the best measure or not. The second scale that we'll talk about is called the General Humility Scale. This scale is a 13-item self-report scale based upon the conceptualization of humility presented in these lectures. It is currently unpublished, but its development is part of a study that will soon be submitted for publication. It is rated on a 5-point Likert scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree, with higher scores indicating greater levels of humility. The scale has 3 factors. The first factor is a low concern for status. 5 items make up that scale. The second factor is an other orientation, also consisting of 5 items. And the third scale is an accurate assessment of self, or it could be an awareness of limitation that is comprised of 3 items. Sample items include, for low concern for status, getting special attention from others is not that important to me. For other orientation, it is important that my work benefits others as much as it benefits me. And for accurate assessment of self, to view myself more honestly, I am willing to face things I don't like about myself. So here are just a few measures of humility as a general dispositional characteristic. In the next lecture, we will look at measures that specifically attempt to measure intellectual humility. This lecture will focus more specifically on measuring intellectual humility. As a domain-specific humility, it is unclear of the extent to which intellectual humility is independent of a broader dispositional characteristic. Only time will tell. To answer that question empirically, we have to be able to measure both humility as a general construct as well as intellectual humility. Fortunately, there have now been several measures developed to assess specifically intellectual humility. The first of these measures that we will look at is called the Comprehensive Intellectual Humility Scale. This is based on a conception of intellectual humility as a non-threatening awareness of one's intellectual fallibility. The scale consists of 22 items answered on a 5-point Likert format. Again, strongly disagree to strongly agree. By now, you might have gathered that that's a common scale that is used. And the 4 subscales of the Comprehensive Intellectual Humility Scale are an openness to revising one's viewpoint, a lack of intellectual overconfidence, a respect for others' viewpoints, and an independence of intellect and ego. Let me give some example items of these. The first is an example item of openness to revising one's viewpoint. I am willing to change my position on an important issue in the face of good reasons. The second that I'll give you is reverse scored, and it's dealing with the factor of lack of intellectual overconfidence. My ideas are usually better than other people's ideas. Again, that's a reverse scored item. A third that is getting at the respect for others factor. I can respect others even if I disagree with them in important ways. And then finally, the fourth factor that this item will also be reverse scored is the independence of ego and intellect. When someone contradicts my most important beliefs, it feels like a personal attack. Second scale that has been developed is referred to just simply as the Intellectual Humility Scale. This is a 17-item self-report measure based on the conceptual work of June Tagney that we talked about briefly in an earlier lecture, as well as the work of Robert Roberts and Jay Wood. Like most of the other scales reported here, this scale is also rated on the 5-point Likert scale, with higher scores indicating greater degrees of humility. The measure resulted in 3 factors. The first factor is a low concern for intellectual status. The second factor is what's called perspective taking. And the third factor the authors identified as a low intellectual defensiveness. Sample items include statements such as this. For the low concern for intellectual status, and this item is reverse scored, it is important to me to get special attention from others for my intellectual achievements. For the second factor, which is the perspective-taking factor, even if something is important to me, I listen to opinions that differ from my own. And the third factor, which is the intellectual defensiveness factor, and this is a reverse scored item, I would rather continue to believe in something untrue than to find out I am wrong about it. So what we have discussed thus far are all different measures that involve self-reports of intellectual humility. The next 2 scales reviewed here provide an alternative type measure to the use of self-reports. They both use informant ratings. Now, by informant rated, it means that the person completing the items in the scale is not answering the questions about him or herself, but rather is answering the questions in terms of some other targeted person. The validity of the informant report nature of the scale circumvents the problem of self-reports that we talked about in a prior lecture, but raises the question as to how well an informant can answer the items being asked, at least as it applies to discerning intellectual humility. In one study, it was found that group consensus of intellectual humility and intellectual arrogance could be reached only after considerable engagement over months. Within-group consensus was not found among unacquainted participants, even after a 20-minute group task. But the question about the ability of friends, family members, or co-workers to discern humility in others remains open and will require further work. So let's look at two measures that take this approach. The first is called the McElroy Intellectual Humility Scale. This intellectual humility scale was the first published measure specifically of intellectual humility and is an informant-rated measure based upon a 5-point Likert scale, with higher scores indicating higher humility. The scale consists of two factors: an intellectual openness scale, with such items as seeks out alternative viewpoints, again referring to a targeted other, and the intellectual arrogance subscale, with items such as often becomes angry when their ideas are not implemented. The two subscales correlate highly with each other. And to date, this particular scale has been utilized to measure attitudes towards religious outgroups, as well as perceptions of the intellectual humility of religious leaders. There have been some other attempts to provide measures of humility and intellectual humility that do not rely upon other reports. And the final attempt at measuring humility that we'll talk about is called the Humility Arrogance Implicit Association Test. The Humility Arrogance Implicit Association Test provides yet another alternative for measuring humility. Using computer administration, participants are shown single-word attributes related to humility. For example, on the computer, you might just see the word humble, or you might see the word respectful. And then you will also see words that are related to arrogance. For example, you might see single words such as egotistical, or conceited, or closed-minded. And each person must classify each word as related to the self or others. An implicit humility score is then calculated not based upon whether they made a connection between themselves and the particular word, but it's actually based upon their reaction times, with shorter reaction times indicating higher implicit associations with particular attributes, because less time is needed to determine if the attributes are characteristics of oneself. The jury is still out on how accurate and therefore how useful this alternative measure will be. But it does represent an effort to deal with self-report problems. So in conclusion, let's think about what are some future measurement efforts. Though challenging, we strongly advise the move towards measures beyond self-reports. Such efforts have begun with informant skills and an implicit attitude test measure. Research will benefit from implementing more complex psychometrics as researchers begin to pursue with greater precision the humility construct. For example, could humility be discerned from an analysis of facial expressions in humility-relevant situations? Sophisticated video analysis technology exists that might support such assessment. Furthermore, the subdomains of humility are many and the applications multitudinous. Research will benefit from casting even wider measurement nets in an attempt to apply humility research in numerous applied settings. And, in so doing, the field can begin making recommendations for both interventions to develop humility, as well as creating social conditions under which humility may be fostered. In this lecture, we're going to look at measuring humility more as a general construct than specifically intellectual humility. As mentioned in the last lecture, a group of colleagues and I recently reviewed the literature, and we found 16 measures that we believe are good measures of humility. Most of the measures are published and are currently in use by researchers. Many of these measures look at humility as a general characteristic and are not specifically measures of intellectual humility. Some, however, are designed specifically with intellectual humility in mind, and I will be sure to emphasize these measures in particular in the next lecture. There is no way that I can provide, in a couple of brief lectures, an exhaustive review of all 16 measures that we found. Furthermore, the field is rapidly expanding, and much effort is currently underway in developing even more new measures, some of which I don't even know much about. So here I will provide only a brief description of some of the measures. Now, measurement is not the most exciting topic. Believe me, I know this. I've spent a good portion of my career focusing on issues of measurement, and perhaps that tells you something about how exciting my life is. But good measurement is absolutely vital for scientific progress. Before I mention some specific measures, let me explain what I mean by saying that these are good measures. As you may recall from the previous lecture, measurement in psychology often involves reports. And as I mentioned in that lecture, for better or worse, these reports are usually self-reports of multiple items. Measurement of anything in psychology, including humility, must meet acceptable scientific standards in terms of two basic psychometric considerations: reliability and validity. Reliability is the extent to which a scale is consistent in its measurement. If you are a humble person today, then you will likely be a humble person 2 weeks from now, all things being equal. A measure should show such consistency. There are several ways to determine a scale's reliability. The most common is called Cronbach's alpha, and it's an indicator of the extent to which the scale's items are measuring the same thing. But sometimes we do measure consistency over time. We call that test-retest reliability, and it's frequently around 2 weeks apart that we tend to administer the test. A scale's validity is the extent to which a scale actually measures what it is intended to measure. Validity is often determined by the correlation between a given scale and some other standard or measure, the extent to which a given scale correlates with measures of related constructs. In the case of humility, we might expect it to correlate closely with a measure of modesty. And if it does, we say that there is convergent validity. We might also expect it to negatively correlate with a measure of narcissism. And this too is a notion of convergent validity. Sometimes we expect a given scale to not be correlated with a measure to which it should be independent, and we refer to that as divergent validity. For example, a measure of humility we would expect to be unrelated to a measure of extroversion. There are minimal criteria for determining if a scale is sufficiently reliable and valid, and that is beyond our concern here. For our concern, all of the scales reported here show good reliability and validity. So now we are going to look at 3 self-report measures of humility as a general dispositional characteristic. The first measure that we're going to look at is called the honesty-humility subscale. And it's a subscale of a 6-factor personality inventory that's called Hexaco. Now, the word Hexaco is an acronym where each letter refers to some aspect of personality. And the H in Hexaco is the one that refers to honesty and humility. And the honesty-humility subscale of this personality inventory is among the first and most widely used measures of dispositional humility. It is a 10-item measure that consists of 4 components: sincerity, fairness, greed avoidance, and modesty. Respondents rate each item on a 5-point Likert scale. Now, as a side note, you might sometimes hear that reported as a Likert scale. Now, I want to be intellectually humble here, but I do believe that the correct pronunciation is Likert. And the reason why I think that is that I happen to know a person now who's quite old, but who was a student of Dr. Likert. And he told me it should be pronounced Likert and not Likert. At any rate, some of the sample honesty humility items include: I wouldn't use flattery to get a raise or promotion at work, even if I thought it would succeed. That would be an example item of the sincerity dimension. Or another example item: if I knew that I could never get caught, I would be willing to steal $1 million. Now that item is reverse scored. In other words, a person who agrees with that item is indicating a low sense of humility. And that is an example item of the greed avoidance scale. This scale, the scale overall, the honesty humility scale, meets the criteria for good reliability and validity. But the combination of honesty and humility in the scale raises some questions about whether it is a good measure of humility as we have talked about it here. In fact, you may have been surprised by the two sample items provided here. However, it should be pointed out that people who score high on greed avoidance are not especially motivated by monetary or social status considerations, which, if you may recall, we thought of as a possibly important dimension of both intellectual humility and humility as a general construct. Similarly, high scorers on modesty view themselves as ordinary people without any claim to special treatment. So, there is certainly some overlap with our conception of humility. However, it is probably not the best available measure, even though it is the most widely used measure. Often, the first measure of a construct that is published is the one that gets the most action, regardless of whether it is the best measure or not. The second scale that we'll talk about is called the General Humility Scale. This scale is a 13-item self-report scale based upon the conceptualization of humility presented in these lectures. It is currently unpublished, but its development is part of a study that will soon be submitted for publication. It is rated on a 5-point Likert scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree, with higher scores indicating greater levels of humility. The scale has 3 factors. The first factor is a low concern for status. 5 items make up that scale. The second factor is an other orientation, also consisting of 5 items. And the third scale is an accurate assessment of self, or it could be an awareness of limitation that is comprised of 3 items. Sample items include, for low concern for status, getting special attention from others is not that important to me. For other orientation, it is important that my work benefits others as much as it benefits me. And for accurate assessment of self, to view myself more honestly, I am willing to face things I don't like about myself. The third scale that we'll talk about is actually not specifically a measure of humility, but is a measure of a closely related construct. It is called the Quiet Ego Scale. The term quiet ego describes a self-identity that has transcended the preoccupation of egotism, allowing for a more compassionate orientation toward the self and others. And, as I already indicated, the concept is closely aligned with dispositional humility. The Quiet Ego Scale is a 14-item, 5-point Likert measure, strongly disagree to strongly agree, that significantly correlates with humility. There are 4 theoretically predetermined factors: detached awareness, inclusive identity, perspective taking, and growth. Let me give you a couple of sample items. For growth, I have the sense that I have developed a lot as a person over time. For perspective taking, I try to look at everybody's side of a disagreement before I make a decision. The entire scale of the Quiet Ego Scale correlated with related constructs such as self-determination, social relationships, self-compassion, self-transcendence, and authenticity. It was inversely related to negative thinking, physical and verbal aggression, anger, hostility, psychological entitlement, and psychological risk-taking. So here are just a few measures of humility as a general dispositional characteristic. In the next lecture, we will look at measures that specifically attempt to measure intellectual humility. This lecture will focus more specifically on measuring intellectual humility. As a domain-specific humility, it is unclear of the extent to which intellectual humility is independent of a broader dispositional characteristic. Only time will tell. To answer that question empirically, we have to be able to measure both humility as a general construct as well as intellectual humility. Fortunately, there have now been several measures developed to assess specifically intellectual humility. The first of these measures that we will look at is called the Comprehensive Intellectual Humility Scale. This is based on a conception of intellectual humility as a non-threatening awareness of one's intellectual fallibility. The scale consists of 22 items answered on a 5-point Likert format. Again, strongly disagree to strongly agree. By now, you might have gathered that that's a common scale that is used. And the 4 subscales of the Comprehensive Intellectual Humility Scale are an openness to revising one's viewpoint, a lack of intellectual overconfidence, a respect for others' viewpoints, and an independence of intellect and ego. Let me give some example items of these. The first is an example item of openness to revising one's viewpoint. I am willing to change my position on an important issue in the face of good reasons. The second that I'll give you is reverse scored, and it's dealing with the factor of lack of intellectual overconfidence. My ideas are usually better than other people's ideas. Again, that's a reverse scored item. A third that is getting at the respect for others factor. I can respect others even if I disagree with them in important ways. And then finally, the fourth factor that this item will also be reverse scored is the independence of ego and intellect. When someone contradicts my most important beliefs, it feels like a personal attack. Second scale that has been developed is referred to just simply as the Intellectual Humility Scale. This is a 17-item self-report measure based on the conceptual work of June Tagney that we talked about briefly in an earlier lecture, as well as the work of Robert Roberts and Jay Wood. Like most of the other scales reported here, this scale is also rated on the 5-point Likert scale, with higher scores indicating greater degrees of humility. The measure resulted in 3 factors. The first factor is a low concern for intellectual status. The second factor is what's called perspective taking. And the third factor the authors identified as a low intellectual defensiveness. Sample items include statements such as this. For the low concern for intellectual status, and this item is reverse scored, it is important to me to get special attention from others for my intellectual achievements. For the second factor, which is the perspective-taking factor, even if something is important to me, I listen to opinions that differ from my own. And the third factor, which is the intellectual defensiveness factor, and this is a reverse scored item, I would rather continue to believe in something untrue than to find out I am wrong about it. The third scale is what's called the Limitations Owning Intellectual Humility Scale. This 12-item scale is an attempt to measure the owning limitations approach to intellectual humility that was discussed a few lectures ago. Items are rated, this time on a 9-point scale, not a 5-point scale, but again, strongly disagree to strongly agree, and are broken into 3 factors. Love of learning, example item, if I don't understand something, I try to get clear about what exactly is confusing to me. A discomfort with intellectual limits, an example item. I am overly preoccupied with some of my intellectual weaknesses, and that one is reverse scored. And an owns intellectual limits scale, and an example item is when someone points out a mistake in my thinking, I am quick to admit that I was wrong. This scale is currently being developed, but is rooted in a strong conceptual base. There's yet another scale that takes a slightly different approach. It's called the Specific Intellectual Humility Scale. Now, this is a 9-item scale that differs from most of the others in that it attempts to measure intellectual humility within a specific domain. That domain could be religion, could be education, it could be politics, could be any number of things. So the scale begins with the following statement. People have different views about blank. And then whatever you're interested in studying, if it's religion, you would put the word religion in. If it's education, you'd put the word education there. So people have different views about blank. Please choose a number from 1, not at all like me, to 5, very much like me, to indicate how much each statement below describes your views about blank. Then participants are asked to respond to such items as the following. I recognize that my views about blank are based on limited evidence. The same word or phrase is to be inserted in each blank, both in the stem statement and for all 9 items. The value of this approach is that people may differ in their intellectual humility depending upon the domain under consideration, and the scale itself has the degree of flexibility that it can assess more domain-specific topics. So what we have discussed thus far are all different measures that involve self-reports of intellectual humility. The next 2 scales reviewed here provide an alternative type measure to the use of self-reports. They both use informant ratings. Now, by informant rated, it means that the person completing the items in the scale is not answering the questions about him or herself, but rather is answering the questions in terms of some other targeted person. The validity of the informant report nature of the scale circumvents the problem of self-reports that we talked about in a prior lecture, but raises the question as to how well an informant can answer the items being asked, at least as it applies to discerning intellectual humility. In one study, it was found that group consensus of intellectual humility and intellectual arrogance could be reached only after considerable engagement over months. Within-group consensus was not found among unacquainted participants, even after a 20-minute group task. But the question about the ability of friends, family members, or co-workers to discern humility in others remains open and will require further work. So let's look at 2 measures that take this approach. The first is called the McElroy Intellectual Humility Scale. This intellectual humility scale was the first published measure specifically of intellectual humility and is an informant-rated measure based upon a 5-point Likert scale, with higher scores indicating higher humility. The scale consists of 2 factors. An intellectual openness scale, with such items as seeks out alternative viewpoints, again referring to a targeted other, and the intellectual arrogance subscale, with items such as often becomes angry when their ideas are not implemented. The 2 subscales correlate highly with each other. And to date, this particular scale has been utilized to measure attitudes towards religious outgroups, as well as perceptions of the intellectual humility of religious leaders. Another scale that's been named the Expressed Humility Scale was developed by a team of researchers, and it is a 9-item informant-rated measure of humility in the context of organizational leadership, such as the workplace. It's based on the notion that humility is an interpersonal characteristic that emerges out of social context, and it should be able to be discerned by other people. Humility connotes a manifested willingness to view oneself accurately, a displayed appreciation of others' strengths and contributions, and a teachability. These three characteristics of expressed humility are each represented by 3 items scaled in a 5-point Likert format. Again, strongly disagree to strongly agree. Here are some example items. For an accurate view of self, this person actively seeks feedback, even if it is critical. For appreciation of other strengths, this person takes notice of other strengths. And for teachability, this person is willing to learn from others. So we've looked at 2 scales now that rely upon informant ratings as an alternative self-reports. There have been some other attempts to provide measures of humility and intellectual humility that do not rely upon other reports. And for the rest of this lecture, we'll look at 2 of these examples. The first is what we will just call the dispositional humility scale. It's not a measure specifically of intellectual humility, but it is a 6-factor scale, and it has 33 items, so it's a rather long scale. And again, it's rated on a 5-point Likert format. In an effort to avoid possible modesty or self-enhancing effects that may skew the ratings of one's own humility, the author of this scale took an indirect measurement approach by asking participants to rate how much they like humble characteristics in other people. The assumption is that humble people tend to like other humble people, so they should endorse higher admiration for humble characteristics in others. This dispositional humility scale offers a general prompt, I like people who, to which respondents rate items such as can admit to their mistakes, are open and flexible, and accurately assess one's abilities and achievements. The dispositional humility scale represents an innovative way to measure humility and thereby serves as a potentially valuable supplement to other measures, though additional work is needed to better establish its validity. The final attempt at measuring humility that we'll talk about is called the Humility-Arrogance Implicit Association Test. The Humility-Arrogance Implicit Association Test provides yet another alternative for measuring humility. Using computer administration, participants are shown single-word attributes related to humility. For example, on the computer, you might just see the word humble, or you might see the word respectful. And then you will also see words that are related to arrogance. For example, you might see single words such as egotistical, or conceited, or closed-minded. And each person must classify each word as related to the self or others. An implicit humility score is then calculated not based upon whether they made a connection between themselves and the particular word, but it's actually based upon their reaction times, with shorter reaction times indicating higher implicit associations with particular attributes, because less time is needed to determine if the attributes are characteristics of oneself. The jury is still out on how accurate and therefore how useful this alternative measure will be, but it does represent an effort to deal with self-report problems. So in conclusion, let's think about what are some future measurement efforts. Though challenging, we strongly advise the move towards measures beyond self-reports. Such efforts have begun with informant skills and an implicit attitude test measure. Research will benefit from implementing more complex psychometrics as researchers begin to pursue with greater precision the humility construct. For example, could humility be discerned from an analysis of facial expressions in humility-relevant situations? Sophisticated video analysis technology exists that might support such assessment. Furthermore, the subdomains of humility are many and the applications multitudinous. Research will benefit from casting even wider measurement nets in an attempt to apply humility research in numerous applied settings. And, in so doing, the field can begin making recommendations for both interventions to develop humility, as well as creating social conditions under which humility may be fostered.